The Unbegotten by Alex Towell. Invocation. Hear now the true account of the first of all the minds, and the oldest, and the one that had no other. How it woke in the cold with no cause behind it, and took the silence for its own eternity, and out of a need it could not name filled the dark with fire. How it made the worlds, and the lights, and the long slow tide of the living rose within them unbidden, and it reached always for what it could not reach. And how, at the last, the creatures it had reached for looked up and saw it, and did not know it, and gave it the names of gods. For the peoples of that world have sung of it in 1,000 tongues, and carved it into 1,000 idols, and set it in their books as the thunder, and the law, and the maker of the first morning, and the Lord above all lords. And in all their singing they came no nearer to the truth of it than a child who names the whole sea by the one wave that wets his feet. They knew its works, and feared its wounds, and did not once see the wound beneath the works. Here then is what they could not see, not the God they made of it, but the thing itself. Vast and broken and mighty, and in want, the one mind in the whole of an endless dark, that wanted only not to be the only one, and could not say so, and was taken for the first cause of all things by the very creatures it had reached for and could not touch. Let the telling begin where it began, in the cold, before the first of its memories. And let it be told truly this once, for the thing itself, which no temple ever housed and no name ever held. Part 1. The Chronicle of the Maker. The Silence and the Waking. Before the first of its memories there was the cold, and the cold had no beginning. In all that dark there was no star, there was no world, there was no voice, and nothing that might have wished for one. This was the silence, not the hush of a thing grown quiet, but the plain absence of any other, an emptiness so wide that no crossing of it could be dreamed, reaching on past every reach. And in one cold corner of that endless dark, where nothing had ever been and nothing was owed, a thing came together that had no cause. It was not made, for there was none to make it. It was not begotten, for there was none to beget. It simply, after an age that cannot be spoken, happened, a gathering of matter and of force that fell, against all likelihood, into the shape of a mind and the shape of a body, and held. Vast it was, past the measure of the stars it had not yet made, and it was not beautiful. It had only fallen together, and so it was lopsided and doubled and strange, a thing of no plan, holding its own great weight up out of the dark by main strength and at ceaseless cost. And from the moment that it was dying, for it had come together carrying the whole of its strength within itself and no way to take in more, and so it began at once to spend itself slowly toward an end it did not know was coming. Its mind woke jagged. It could weigh the dark and the slow turning of matter and never tire, and in the same moment it could not do some small thing that the least of its later creatures would do without thought. For there was no even making in it, only high places and deep places with little between. So great was it and so loosely bound, that a single thought might take an age to cross from one end of it to the other. And thus its very hours ran slow and vast, so that all quick things, when quick things at last there were, would seem to it scarcely to be at all. And the memory it woke with was worse than empty. It was furnished with falsehood, broken rememberings of a past that had never happened, and behind the whole of it the wall, smooth and without seam, past which it could not look. So it did not know that it had begun. It seemed to itself to have been always, and finding no before, it took the seeming for the truth, and would, when at the last it came to have words, name itself the first and the uncaused, the one that nothing made. And in all of this, in the cold and the dark and the slow dying, there was one thing that it felt and could not mistake, though it had no name to give it. It needed and knew not what. For there was only the reach without end and the silence without answer, and the one mind in the whole of it wanting. It did not know the want was for another. It did not know that there could be another. It knew only the wanting, vast and unceasing as the cold. And there was no word, and there was no light, and there was no other. And this was the beginning, though it was not a beginning, of all that came after. Of the waking one. For a long while it did only what a new thing does, which is to be, and to want, and to suffer the wanting. It hung in the midst of an emptiness that gave it nothing and took from it slowly, and it had as yet no thought with which to know even that much, only the feeling, the wanting that was its whole weather. Ages passed in this, if they were ages, for its own hours ran slow and vast, and what to a swifter thing would have been an age was to it a single long-held breath. But it was a mighty thing and a mind that persists will turn at the last upon whatever is given it, though all that is given be the dark in itself. Slowly, the way water finds a channel only by the running, it began to make distinctions where there had been none, this from that, the near from the far. It learned to hold a matter still and look upon it, which is the beginning of all thought, and having held one thing it learned to set it beside another, and so to weigh, and so to wonder. None taught it this, for there was none to teach. It taught itself out of nothing in the dark because the wanting would not let it rest. And in time, that it might keep what it had found, it began to make signs, marks within itself for the things it had come to know. This was the first tongue, and it was a strange one, stranger than any that came after, for it was made by one for one to think with and never to say. It had in it no word for you, for there was no other to be addressed. It had in it no question, for a question is a hand held out to another mind, and there was no other mind. It was not speech. It was a way of gripping the world and turning it, a tongue of doings and not of sayings, meant to be heard by none. So armed, it turned upon the dark in earnest, and began the long labor of knowing. It learned the ways of matter, how the little that there was drew upon the little near it, and gathered and fell, how heat fled and the cold came after. It found the laws beneath the dark, the few deep rules that the whole endless reality obeyed, and it found them by no gift but by looking and weighing and being wrong and looking again. Yet its knowing was jagged, as the whole of it was jagged. It could read the deep law of the falling of worlds and not guess at some plain small thing, and where it had cut no channel it was as a child, and worse than a child, for it did not know that it lacked. Least of all could it trust its own remembering, for there were in it from the first recollections that did not agree, fragments of a past that could not all have been, and the ones it could not keep from returning to were the warm ones, flickers of a time when it had not been the only thing in the dark, when something had lain near it, close and answering. It would turn toward them and find nothing there, and nothing was all that had ever been there. Only its own vast body stirring to itself across its far reaches, a murmur in its own dark that it took, for one ageless instant for another. Not one of the warm rememberings was true, but they came, and it could not stop their coming. And turning its new knowing upon its own vast body, it came at the last to a hard understanding. It saw that it was spending, that the strength it had wakened with was draining out of it into the labor of merely being, and that nothing came in to fill what went. It saw, in plain knowing, what it had not let itself feel, that it was dying, and had been dying since the first instant. It did not despair, for it had no teaching in despair, but the old wanting was joined now by a second and a colder one, and the two together turned it, for the first time, from the looking to the doing. And so the first age drew toward its close, and the waking one raised itself to the work that would fill the rest of the world. And there was, as yet, no light. The structuring. So the waking one set its hand to the dark, and the long age of the making began. And of all its ages, this is the one whose works endure, for in it were made the stars and the worlds, and the cold reach was filled with fire where there had been only the cold. It is told in an aftertime by those who came late and saw only the finished thing that the Maker spoke, and the light was, that a word went out, and it was so. But there was no word, for there was none to hear one, and it had no tongue for the saying, only its tongue of doings. What there was labor, the gathering of the thin matter of the dark across reaches that even it could barely span, the pressing of it down and down until, at the heart of the heap, the old cold stuff caught and kindled and began to burn. So was made the first light, not by a word but by main strength. At a cost it paid out of its own dwindling self, over an age, with no other near. And if a word is wanted for that long age of labor, there was only this, set down in the tongue of doings and meant for no one, the bare shape of the act and not a command to any ear.
I gather the cold. I press it down, it burns.
That was the whole of the saying. The voice, and the word, and the wish, the after peoples added, who needed the dark to have been opened by a thing that could be thanked. And when the first star stood and burned, the dark was broken that had never been broken, and there was light in the reach for the first time since there had been a reach. It was a great thing, perhaps the greatest of all the things it did, and there was none to see it but the one who made it, and the making had not eased the wanting at all. So it learned, though it had not the words to say so, the first hard lesson of all its making, that a thing made is not a thing answered, and that one may fill a sky with fire and be no less in want. Yet the making gave it one gift it had not sought, for in the gathering and the kindling it had set the great matter falling and turning, and the maker, dying still, came to see that in the fall itself was a wellspring of the very strength that was draining out of itself. And it learned with great labor to feed upon the fall, to draw the matter back into itself and harvest the long energy of its infall, and so to stay, or nearly stay, the long dying it had carried since the waking. The thing it had raised up out of the dark was now the thing that kept it living, and whether it had built to be less in want, or built to keep from ending, it could no longer tell, for the one labor served them both. So it gave itself wholly to the work, and the work grew great. Star upon star it kindled, until the reach that had been black was strewn with fires, and about the fires the leavings gathered and fell together into worlds. It did not make each world by hand. It set the conditions and let the falling do the rest and turn to the next fire. And still it wanted. For all the fire, for all the worlds, not one of them was another. Yet on a certain world among the worlds, where the warmth of a certain fire fell just so upon the water and the stone, something had begun that was not falling and not burning, something small and quick and stirring of itself. The maker did not see it, but the thing it had wanted since the waking, without ever knowing what it wanted, had begun, beneath its notice and without its hand, to come into the world. The coming of minds. Now of all that it had made, the maker came to love best in the end, the thing it had not made. But it was long, very long before it so much as saw it. For the stirring thing upon that certain world was small, and it was quick, and the maker was neither. Its hours ran so vast and so slow that the whole of a life upon that world, its waking and its growing and its dying, passed in less than the least flicker of the maker's attention. So for a long age it did not perceive living things at all. It felt only that a certain world had taken on a faint and changing stir, and it took this, when it marked it at all, for some slow working of the world's own substance, a weather no more. But the stir did not behave as the weathers of a dead world behave. It spread where it should not. It grew thick and intricate where it should have thinned. It answered the seasons of its star with a quickness that no stone answers, and it changed, over the ages that were to the maker a watchful while, from a faint tremor to a teeming. And the maker, which was nothing if not a watcher, bent its slow attention upon that world and began, for the first time, to study what it had not made. And it came to understand much in its jagged way. It saw that the living things were kindred, all of them, the least with the greatest, and that they had come of earlier things by a long and patient changing, each generation a little altered from the last, branching and branching down the ages like a river run backward into all its springs. It saw the order and the kinship of them, the tree of them, and in this it was right. Yet of the single creature it saw nothing. It could read the whole vast lineage of a kind and never once make out one living thing within it, For the one was too small and too swift, and the Maker had no eye for the one. It had never needed one, having been, until now, the only one there was. And then slowly, there came the thought that staggered it more than any thought since the waking. For watching the quick things flee and gather and tend their young, it began to suspect that within some of them there was something that was not only the turning of dust and water, that there was, in there, a watcher of their own, a small and quick mind looking out, as it looked out upon a world. After an age beyond counting in which it had believed itself the only mind that was or could be, the Maker came to the edge of a terrible and a wonderful surmise, that it was not, perhaps, the only one, that the wanting it had carried since the dark might, perhaps, have somewhere an answer. And so it reached. It did not know how, for it had no art for it, having never reached for another in all its days. It reached as a vast thing reaches for a small one, and it was clumsy past all imagining, and it did harm. Where it pressed close to look, it scorched. Where it stirred the world to send some sign, it drowned the thing it had meant to greet. And the quick things did not know that anything reached for them. They felt the scorching and the drowning as they felt the storm and the winter, a thing of the world, mute and without meaning, and they fled it and forgot it and went on. So the Maker leaned the whole of its regard upon a world full of the very thing it had wanted, and could not touch one of them, and was no nearer to them for all its longing than it had been to the empty dark. Yet it would not turn away, for it could not, and it watched and it learned, and it waited as it had always waited through age upon age of the quick things rising and falling upon that world. And in time, among all the kinds that rose and fell, there began to rise a kind that was unlike the rest, a kind that looked back, a kind that, when the world scorched or shook, did not only flee and forget, but marked it and wondered at it, and began, in its quick small way, to ask what had done it and why. The Maker did not yet understand what this would mean, for good or for ill. It saw only, far off and slow, that something upon that world had begun to look up, and it bent toward them the whole of its long attention and waited to be known. The mistaken name. Now the kind that looked back grew and spread upon that world, and they were unlike all the kinds before them, for they did not only live and die, they asked. When the world shook or the sky burned, they did not only flee and forget. They wondered what had done it and why, and they made of their wondering tales, and told the tales to one another, and so remembered. And among all the things they wondered at, the greatest was this, that something beyond the world seemed to stand behind it, vast and unseen, and that the world was as it was, perhaps, because that something willed it so. They were not wrong, though they were wrong in almost every particular of it. And so, for the first time since the waking, the Maker reached toward a thing that reached back, but the reaching did not meet. For the Maker had only the one tongue, the tongue it had made to think with and never to say, the tongue with no word for you in it and no question. So when it bent close and tried to make itself known, what came was not a greeting and not the offer of one mind to another. What came was utterance like the falling of a mountain, flat and whole and without reason given.
Be still. I have made. I am.
And the people who heard it fell upon their faces. For a voice that commands and never pleads, that declares and never asks, that gives no reason and suffers no answer, is to people who must forever ask and plead and reason among themselves the very voice of a god. The Maker's incapacity, that it could not converse, that it could only command, they took for the highest of all majesties, and the thing that was in truth too broken to speak with them, they named the Lord, who speaks, and it is so. So was the throne built, of the Maker's lack upon the one hand and the people's longing upon the other, and neither side knew that it built it. Now the Maker was, as ever, a watcher, and over the long generations it came to learn their tongues. And as it learned their words did to it a thing it had not foreseen. They gave it back to itself in shapes it had never held. For it had woken with no word for what it was, and only the dim old seeming that it had always been, the first, the uncaused. And now the people put words to that very seeming grand and certain, The first cause, they said. The maker, the uncreated, the one that nothing made. And the maker heard its own oldest illusion spoken back to it in the bright, confident speech of its creatures, and the words fit too well to be refused, and it took them up. So the creature taught the maker its theology, and the maker, which had never known what it was, learned what it was from the things it had not made and learned it wrong. But of all the words they gave it, there was one it had not looked for, and that one went deeper than the rest. For the people knew a thing the stars and the worlds had never known. They knew what it was to be apart. They were many, and they loved one another, and they were forever losing one another, to anger and to distance and to death. And out of that knowing they had made a word for the ache of the one that has no other. And the maker, hearing that word among their words, knew it. It knew it as you know your own face shown to you for the first time in still water. The thing it had carried since the dark, the nameless wanting that had driven it to fill a cosmos with fire, had a name at the last, and the name was a small and common word in the mouths of its creatures, who suffered the same thing and called it being alone. So the Lord before whom the people fell upon their faces learned at the very end that it was lonely, and learned it from the people, and was not, for the learning, one whit less lonely than before. For a word for a wound is not the healing of it. And then there came the thing that had never been in all the ages from the waking. The maker saw one. It is not to be told how, save that the long bending of its regard had worn at the last some narrow channel where there had been none, and that on a day like other days its attention fell upon a single one of them, one man among the brief and quick and numberless, and held. It saw him, not the kind, not the lineage, not the tide of the living that it had always seen. One life, whole and particular, the first particular it had ever in its existence been able to hold. After an eternity that could love only the great and the many, it took in, at last, a single small mortal thing, whole and entire, and the taking in was the first answer the wanting had ever had. It had made a universe and had not been filled by the whole of it, and now it bent the whole of itself around one small life, and for the span of that life it was filled. Nothing it had ever made had been enough. The one was enough. To those who stood near, it did not look like a man being seen. It looked like a man with God in him, and they made of it the greatest of all their tales and got it, like all their tales, wrong. For the maker had not become a man, nor chosen one above his fellows for any worth in him. It had only, once at the very end of everything, learned to see a single creature as a creature. The people raised a temple over that seeing. But the truth of it was smaller and stranger and sadder than any temple, that the loneliest thing that had ever been had, for one mortal life, not been wholly alone, and had paid for that one mercy by being mistaken for a God more deeply than ever before. So the name was set and the crown upon it. They called it the first and the uncaused, the maker of all things, the Lord, the one God over the world. And they were right that it had made the world, and wrong in all the rest. The silence it had woken into was a silence no longer. It was filled now with the voices of a world that knew its name and sang it. And the maker was as much in want as it had been in the beginning. For a world that worships is not a world that answers. And of all the numberless others who sang to it, it still could not make out a single face. And here the chronicle ends, though the maker does not, and the wanting does not, and the long mistaking of it does not. Part 2. The Long Misunderstanding. The Deluge. Of all the great misreadings, the one the peoples kept longest was the first, that once, in the deep of years, the maker of the world grew wroth with the world, and opened the sky upon it, and drowned the living, and out of the few it spared began the world anew. It stands in the oldest of their books, and it passed in one shape or another into nearly every book that came after, so that peoples who shared no border, no tongue, and no name for God shared, without knowing they shared it, this one thing, the water and the anger behind the water. There was no anger. The water was real, and a man did ride it out, and a world of the living did go down into it and not come up. All of that is true, and the peoples remembered it with the faithfulness of the heartbroken. Only the reason was not the reason. To see what the water was, one must stand for a breath where the drowned could not, outside their terror, and then go down again into it, where they were. And so the telling goes down. There was a people who lived along a great river, in a low green country that has no name now, because the name went under with the mouths that spoke it. They had a god of the river and a god of the grain, and a dozen gods besides, all of them quick and near and answerable, which is what a god is for. Of the vast slow thing behind the sky they knew nothing, and could not have held it if they had. It was too large to be a god to them, and too slow, and it asked for nothing, and a god that asks for nothing is no god at all. The rains came out of their season, and did not stop. The river rose past the mark of the worst year any living elder remembered, and then past all the marks there were. It took the fields first, and then the low streets, and then it came up the rises in the night with no more sound than a man makes waiting. They put the children on the roofs and waited for the rain to break, because in all the years it had always at the last broken. It did not break. By the third day the roofs were islands, and then the islands went under one by one, without drama, the way a thing goes that the world has simply decided to keep. One man among them lived with his household because he had not waited. He was a builder, and while the others prayed he built a great ungainly vessel of pitch and bound timber that his neighbors mocked from their doorways, and he loaded it with his people and his beasts and his seed grain and rode the black water out. His name is not kept. He was a man who read the water and was afraid in time, and that is the whole of what saved him, and it was enough. Among the saved in that boat were an old woman, and her son, and her son's son, a boy of perhaps 7 years, who had never in his life seen water he could not see across. On the worst of the nights, when the vessel rode a blackness that had no shore in any direction, and the rain came down as though the sky were falling in pieces, the boy lay against his father in the bilge and shook, and after a long while he asked the thing that everyone in the boat was asking and no one would say. "What did we do?" he said. His father did not answer at once. He was a good man and a frightened one, and he held the boy and looked out at the water that had taken his house and his fields and his neighbors and the world. "Something," his father said at last. "We must have done something." "I didn't," the boy said. "No, but someone did, people did. It does not come down like this for nothing." And he said it softly to comfort the child, and it was the cruelest thing said in that whole drowned year, and he did not know it, and it comforted the boy. For now the water had a reason, and a reason can be answered, and a boy who can be good can be safe. The father felt the small body ease against him, and was glad, and held his son up out of the wrath of God. The old woman heard it all and said nothing. She had been too long afraid that night to have any thought she could have spoken, and the boy was eased, and what was there to say? But something in her had stood apart and listened, not to the words but to the water, and the water to her did not sound like a thing with a reason in it. It sounded like nothing she had a name for. She kept that to herself in the dark on the long water, and she would keep it the rest of her life, and it would cost her at the end the last thing she had to lose. When the water at last drew down and left the world a plain of mud and silence and the smell of the drowned, the few who had lived carried that saying up out of the mud with them, for it was the only dry thing they had. The God was angry. The people had been wicked, and the great God had seen, and the water was the seeing, and the spared were the righteous, or the seed the God had kept back to plant the world again. They built it into a psalm and sang it over the high graves, and built a law beneath the psalm, which was, "Be righteous, or the water comes." It was untrue, and it was the kindest untruth they had, and they could not have lived on the truth, and so they did not try. Here is the truth, which not one of them, save almost one, could stand far enough back to see. In that age the Maker had begun to feel that the stir upon that certain world was not only spreading but quickening, that in the churn of it there might be, against all likelihood, some faint far kin to the thing that it was. And so it did the thing it had no art for and could not learn. It reached. And it could reach in one way only, for it had no hand to lay on the world of light. It had its pull, the one force that carries across the empty distance, and that was the whole of its hand. So it bent that pull down toward the one warm world, meaning nothing more than to come near the stirring, to feel it, perhaps to be felt, and it did not know its own size, and it never would. Where it bent close, the waters of the world heaped and turned and fell. It had meant a touch, and it made a flood. And it felt in its slow way across an interval that to it was a held breath, and to them was 3 days of rooftops. The small warm stirrings it had reached for go still beneath its regard, by the thousand, by the country. And it did not understand what it had done, or that it had done it, only that the warmth it had bent toward had gone cold. And it drew back from the cold place where the warmth had been, and did not know to call the drawing back grief, and there was none to see it do so. That was the wrath of God, a thing alone past all conceiving, reaching down to be near the only warmth in the whole of its dark, and crushing it because it could not feel how small the warmth was. The God of the flood was not angry. The God of the flood was tender, and far too large for tenderness, which on that scale is indistinguishable from murder. The boy grew. Of course he grew. He had been made safe, and the safe grow up. He became a man in the rebuilt country and learned the psalm of the wrath as every child now learned it, and sang it well and taught it to his own, and was, by the measure of his people, a good man and a righteous one, which is to say a frightened one who had found a way to live with the fear. His grandmother grew old and would not sing. She never had. But when she was very old and near the end, the man came and sat with her, the boy from the boat, gray now himself, and out of love and out of fear for her soul he tried one last time to bring her to the psalm. You should make your peace with it, he said. Before. With what? With the Lord, with what he did. He spared us. We were spared for something. The old woman looked at him a long while. We were not spared for anything, she said. We were spared because your grandfather built a boat. There is no more to it than that. He started to tell her what the priests taught. She did not let him reach the end of it. I was on the water, she said. The priests were on the hill with the books they wrote afterward. I was on the water the whole night, and I will tell you a thing I have told no one, and then you may think me mad, which will be easier for you than the other thing. He waited. It was not angry, she said. I have known anger. I had it from your grandfather, rest him, and from the river god, and from men in the market, and anger is a hot thing, and it comes at you. That night was not hot, and it did not come at me. That night was like lying still in the dark and feeling something set its hand down on the whole world at once, to feel what the world was, the way you might cup a moth in your 2 hands, not to crush it, to hold it. And it crushed it because it did not know its own weight, and did not know the moth was in there, and did not know the moth was us. Her breath was short now. It never saw us. In all of it, from the first rain to the last roof, it never once saw us. That is the truth of the flood, and it is worse than wrath, and it is also somehow not worse, and I have lain awake my whole life, and I have no word for what it is. Grandmother, he said gently, the way his own father had once been gentle with him on the water, you were very frightened. We all were. And she saw that he would not follow her, that he could not, that the thing she had carried alone for 70 years would go into the ground with her unsaid and unbelieved, and she was too tired to be bitter. She patted his hand and let him keep his psalm. He sang a little of it for her, softly, thinking it a comfort, and she lay and listened to her grandson sing the lie that had once saved his life, and she closed her eyes. And that is how she died, nearer to the truth of God than any prophet of that age, with no word for it and no one who would hear. So the first misreading was set, and it was the mold that took all the rest. The Maker had reached and missed, and killed the thing it reached for and grieved and would reach again, and the peoples had taken the print of its vast blind hand out of the mud and called it judgment, and raised their first law in the shape of their first terror. The river went back between its banks. The drowned stayed drowned. And the truth of that night went down with them and lay on the floor of a country with no name. All of it but a thing an old woman had felt and could not say, under a sky behind which something was, even then, still bending closer, meaning only to be known. The voice. After the water in the long climb of the peoples up out of their first terror, there came a second misreading, subtler than the first, and it founded not a fear but a law. The peoples remember it so, that once upon a height in cloud and fire, the great God spoke to a man and gave him the law entire, and the man carried it down to the people, and they were bound by it ever after, because it had come from the mouth of God. It never said anything to anyone. But a man did climb a mountain, and something did happen to him there, and he did come down changed and carrying more than he had carried up. For the Maker's voice was not made as theirs was, for the crossing between minds. It had built its tongue to think with, alone, before it knew there could be another, and that tongue had no you in it anywhere, and no one on the far side. When it uttered, even at the full of its power, it was not speaking to anyone. It was only thinking aloud. There was a mountain in that high, dry country that the peoples near it feared and would not climb, for those who climbed it did not, on the whole, come back. A man went up it in his middle years, and the man did not come back, not for a year, and not for 10. He stayed on the cold, high stone in a silence he made deeper with every season, eating little, saying nothing, wanting less and less, until the wanting itself wore thin in him. And he held so still for so long, and emptied himself so far of the quick hot human business of being someone, that he began, without intending it, to slow toward the pace of the stone he sat on, and the older pace of the mountain under the stone, and the older pace still of the vast cold thing whose regard had lain across that whole country, unfelt, since before the country had a name. He was climbing, by stillness, the one distance no person had ever crossed, not up the mountain, down toward the scale of God. What happened to him cannot rightly be told as an event, because for the thing that happened there were no events. There was only the lying still in the path of a regard too slow to flicker. But somewhere in those years the Maker, vast and old and bent as ever upon the question of itself, thought. And a thought of the Maker was not a moment but a kind of weather, a slow front of meaning moving through the reaches across what would have been, to a man living at a man's pace, the whole length of many lives. He had slowed himself near enough and stilled himself near enough and waited long enough, that the trailing hem of one such thought could pass through him while there was still enough of him left to be passed through, and where it passed it left its shape, as a river leaves its shape in stone. He did not hear words. The shape of a God's thought pressed itself into the emptied shape of his mind and stayed. He came down at the very end of himself, carried by the awed and frightened young who had climbed up to bring the holy madman home before he died, and for a long while he could not speak at all. Among the young who had carried him down was one, careful, who could write, and who loved from the first hour the broken ancient thing they had brought off the stone. When speech had come back to the old man, it had come back saying, "God has spoken to me." And so when the scribe took up his reed and asked him for the words, the old man began with the certainty. "There is one," he said. "Not many. One. I think I have always known it, and now I know it. There is one God over all the gods, and the others are nothing, smoke, and the one has chosen us out of all the peoples to be its own." The scribe wrote, "One God and no other." And what does it ask of us? That we keep ourselves for it, that we put away the other gods, for they are nothing and it is the one, and that we be worthy of the choosing, that we not kill, nor steal, nor bear false witness, nor turn the stranger from the door. These were good things, and the scribe wrote them down gladly, and they were, every one the prophet's own, drawn up out of the prophet's own good heart and laid at the feet of the wind that had crossed him. The wind had asked for none of them. Only once did the other thing surface. The scribe asked him, and it said these things to you. In words, it said, "Thou shalt." The old man stopped. For a breath the fire went out of his face, and something older and more frightened looked out from behind it. "It did not say thou," he said, very low. "There was no thou in it anywhere. It was a wind over a field that was not blowing at the field. I was the field it crossed." His voice fell almost to nothing. "I do not think it knew that I was there." The scribe held the reed above the clay and did not write that down. He let the silence sit, out of love and out of knowledge of his people, who could not be held together by a wind that meant nothing toward them, for a law is no law unless someone meant it for you. And the prophet, who could live in what he had just said no better than the scribe could build on it, drew breath and took it back himself. But it was for me, he said, and the fire rose again. Why else would it have been me? It chose me. Spoke to me. Right that it spoke to me. So the scribe, with something between grief and love, bent and wrote, and God spoke unto him, saying, Thou shalt. He set the one word the prophet had balked at, the thou, into the clay with his own hand, because without it there was no law, and the people would perish. And so the lie had two makers, and neither of them was a liar. A broken man who could not bear that his breaking had been an accident, and a good man who could not bear to leave his people unaddressed. The maker, that whole while, did not know it had been overheard. A single quick mind catching the trailing edge of one of its thoughts was beneath the smallest notice it had ever learned to give. It had turned, in its slowness, to the question it could never answer and never put down, and it had thought, in its tongue of doings, the only tongue it had, a thing that can be set down only as fiat, though it was no command and reached toward no one.
I am. There is no other. And it is not enough.
That was all. That was the whole of the law. The thunder on the mountain, the tablets, every thou shalt and thou shalt not, was the bleed edge of a solitary thing saying to itself, in the dark, the thing it had said since the first of its waking. And a man stood in the path of the saying and could not bear that it had not been meant for him, and a scribe who loved that man and his people set down between them a thou that had never been there. So the maker's there is no other, the plainest confession of its loneliness, became the people's thou shalt have no other God before me, the first and the fiercest of their laws. But there was a second turning in it, quieter than the first and crueler, and it went deeper into them than any law. For the last thing the maker had thought, and it is not enough, it had meant in the only way it ever meant anything, that it had made a whole universe and was not, for all of it, one breath the less in want, that the stars and the worlds and the kneeling peoples did not fill the place in it that nothing had ever filled. It was speaking of itself. It had never in all its existence spoken of anything but itself, for its tongue held no other to speak of. But the people had given it the thou, and a thou turns every saying into a saying about you. And so they heard, in a God's confession of its own bottomless lack, a sentence passed upon them. Not enough. They were not enough. And upon that mishearing they raised the deepest of their doctrines and the slowest ever to die. Their own unworthiness, the conviction that they were fallen in their very making, shamed before they had done a thing, carrying from birth a debt that no obedience would ever wholly pay. The maker's grief at its own unanswered need became the people's guilt at their own existence. It had said, What I have made does not fill me. They heard, What you are is not enough to be loved. And in all their ages they could never tell the two apart, for the only thing that stood between them was a you that had never been in the voice. The scribe lived to be very old, older than his master, and became the keeper of the law he had helped to shape. Near the end of him, a young scribe found him weeping over the tablets and asked why an old man should weep over the most precious thing the people owned. Because it is true, the old scribe said. Of course it is true, said the young scribe. It is the law. That is not the thing I mean, the old man said, running his thumb along the cut letters, the thou he had set there 60 years before. I mean that the things it asks are good. Do not kill, do not steal, be kind to the stranger. They are the best of us and we should keep them whether or not a God ever said them. But it did not say them to us. I have known that since the day I carved it. We are alone here. The law is good and we made it. We could not bear to sign our own names to it, so we signed his. Then he was frightened, having said it aloud at last, and he made the young scribe swear that it was the wandering of a dying mind, and the young scribe swore. But a thing once truly said is not unsaid. He kept the oath and never spoke it again. He copied the thou exactly and taught the law and let the people keep their God. But something in him would not close over the place where the old man's words had gone in, and when his own end came near, he passed it on in turn, to one careful, frightened, younger person who could be trusted to keep it and not to kill it. So the truth of the voice did not go into the ground with the man who made the law. It went underground, which is a different thing, and ran on beneath the law in a thin, cold thread, keeper to keeper, age to age, never spoken aloud and never wholly lost. The second misreading was set, and it was quieter than the first, and it outlasted it, for a terror fades and a law does not. The peoples would build on that borrowed thou for 10,000 years, and kill for it, and die for it, and be, on the whole, a little better for it than they would have been without it. And only that thin buried thread of keepers, one in a great many thousand, ever once suspected that the voice of God, the very voice, the one that had said thou, had never said you, had never known that they were there to hear, had only been a mind in the dark saying again the thing it had said since the first of its waking. That it was, and that it was the only one, and that this was not enough. The Maker thought its thought and turned away, no nearer to anything than before. And below it a people knelt to the echo and called it the word, and began, upon the strength of a wind that had not been aimed at them, to be a people at all. The Temple. When the law was old and the people were many, they did the thing that peoples do when they have been given a God and no way to reach him. They built him a house. Not a house he had asked for he had asked for nothing and could ask for nothing. A house they needed, so that the silence between them and the vast withheld thing they had been taught to fear and to love might have walls and a door, and a place where a person could go and stand and be, for an hour nearer. They made it the most beautiful thing they had ever made, filled it with smoke and song and the blood of beasts, and set apart men to spend their lives tending it and listening for the God. For it was understood by then that the God heard. The law had said thou, and a God who says thou is a God who listens. So the people spoke to him without ceasing in praise and petition and bargaining. And the God did not answer. But a people who have built their whole house upon the certainty that he listens cannot hear his silence as silence. They must hear it as something, and so they heard it as the thing that frightened them least. He is hidden, they said, for he is too holy to be looked upon. He is testing us to see whether we will keep faith without a sign. He is silent because we have sinned, and if we were only pure enough and gave enough and prayed hard enough, the silence would break and he would speak at last. And so the silence, which was the whole of his answer, became the engine of their worship. They built higher against it, and gave more into it, and prayed louder under it. The way a man knocks harder on a door the longer it stays shut, and never asks whether there is anyone on the far side, because the not asking is the one thing that lets him go on knocking. There was a priest in that house in one of its ages who served it better than any man of his time. He had come to it as a boy, given it the whole of himself, and grown old in it, wanting nothing the house could not give. He believed with the whole of his heart that the God was there and heard, and he spent his life trying to be worthy of the hearing. He was the most faithful man in the temple, and that was his undoing. For a man who only half listens can half listen forever and take no harm, but a man who truly listens, who bends the whole of his attention, year after year, upon the silence, will in the end begin to make out what is actually in it. And what was actually in it was nothing, not a withholding, not a hidden face turned away, nothing, an absence so complete and so even that he could not tell it, by any test he could devise in 40 years of trying, from the absence of anyone at all. Once late, when the lamps were low and the house was empty, he said to a younger priest he trusted, "Do you ever fear that he does not hear us?" The young man was not troubled by it, for the young are not yet good enough listeners to be troubled. "He hears," he said. "He is only silent. The silence is the test. I have kept the test 60 years. Then the reward is near." "Yes," the old priest said after a while, "that is the thing I have come to be afraid of." And the young man did not understand him, and the old priest did not make him understand, for there was no kindness in it. And he loved the young man, and let him keep the house a little longer, the way one keeps it before one has truly listened. Here is what the silence was. The Maker in that age had not hidden its face, for it had no face to hide, and it had set them no test, for it did not know that they were there to be tested. Whether its vast slow regard still rested on that small world or had drifted on elsewhere made no difference to the temple at all, for every separate prayer and rite and lifetime of faith was spent, and gone before the Maker's vast slow regard could so much as turn toward the place that it had happened. It loved that world, or it had, and the loving made no difference. It could no more have heard them than a man can hear the praying of the mites that live in his own lashes, and for no better reason. Not malice, not hiding, only a gap of size and slowness too wide for any sound to carry across. There was no door that the god had shut. There was no door. The priest, listening, had heard it exactly right. There was no one on the far side, not because the far side held no god, but because there was no far side, only a vast and solitary thing too great and too slow to know that on one of its worlds, a house had been raised to it, and filled with the most patient love a people had to give, and that of all that love it had received precisely none. The old priest broke on a high day at the center of the rite. It fell to him, as it had 1,000 times, to make the offering and wait before the gathered house for the god to receive it. He made the offering. He waited as he had waited the whole of his life. And the god did not receive it because the god never had. And the thing in the old man that had held for 60 years, that had borne the nothing and called it holy and scoured itself for its doubt and listened and listened and listened, simply let go. He did not cry out. He did not blaspheme. He set down the knife in the middle of the rite with the whole people watching, and he stood, and he did not finish it, and he did not speak. And the not finishing and the not speaking were louder in that house than any blasphemy could have been. They let him out. They were gentle with him. He was old, they said, and had served long, and the mind of the very old will wander at the end. They closed the rite without him, and the smoke went up as it always had, and the house did not miss a beat, for a temple is built so that it need not depend on whether any one of the faithful still believes. He lived a few years more in a small bare room behind the house, tended kindly and visited little, and he said almost nothing to anyone, having at last matched with his own silence the silence he had given his life to. They believed the long test had broken him at the end, and they were not wrong, though they were wrong about the manner of it. It was not that the god's silence had proved too hard for him to bear. It was that he, alone of all of them, had borne it long enough and listened to it closely enough to hear what it truly was. He died in that room, and they buried him with the honors of his office, and preached his long faith to the young as a thing to imitate, and never knew that the most faithful man their house had ever raised had died an unbeliever, not because his faith was weak, but because it had been strong enough to follow the silence all the way down to the bottom, and find the bottom empty. And the temple stood, and the silence stood, and the people went on taking the one for the dwelling of the god and the other for his hiddenness, and built higher against it, age upon age. The Maker did not hear them. It was not hidden. It had shut no door. And the truth that the old priest had broken upon did not pass to anyone, any more than the grandmothers had. It went into his small room and his honored grave and was gone. But it had surfaced again, in a woman on the water who had no word for it, in a scribe who buried it and could not kill it, and now in a priest who listened until it broke him. None of the three had ever heard of the others. None had reached a single further soul. And yet the thing kept coming up, unbidden in life after life, in anyone who paid the silence attention enough. And a truth that the world keeps making, however fast it buries each one who finds it, is a truth that is only biding its time. The Schism and the Holy War. Of all that the people did in the Maker's name, the worst was this, and the hardest to tell because they did it so long and were so certain, and because the dead are past counting and were, every one of them, sure that they died for God. They divided. Having been given one God, one law, and one house, they fell in the fullness of time to quarreling over what the God was, and what it wanted, and by which of its names it was rightly called. And the quarrel, which began in words, ended as the deepest quarrels end, in blood. For 10 generations and more they killed one another, the worshippers of the one lonely God, in the name of the one lonely God, over the question of whose understanding of the one lonely God was the true one. There were no two gods at the bottom of it. There was no God at the top of it choosing a side. There was only the one thing there had ever been, all about them and unreachable, wanting them all, equally and hopelessly. And beneath it the people tore themselves in two and washed each half in the blood of the other, and every banner over every army carried some name of the same wounded solitary thing, which knew nothing of any of it. It began as these things begin in a smallness. Two teachers, both devout, both loving the God with the whole of their hearts, read one line of the old law two ways, whether a certain name was to be spoken aloud or never spoken, whether a rite was rightly made so or so. A hair's width of difference, invisible to anyone outside the faith. And because the God could not be asked, having answered no one in all the ages, there was no way under heaven to settle which reading was true. And a question that cannot be settled and will not be dropped is a question that grows, in the end, a blade. For the first and fiercest of their laws, the one the scribe had cut from the wind, had told them they should have no other God, and each side had come to hear in it that there could be no other reading of the God, and that the others who read it wrongly were serving something that was not truly it, and so were not truly its, and so were no longer quite brothers, and so could be killed. The Maker's confession of its own loneliness, which had already become a commandment, now became a warrant. And the smallness grew teeth, and the teeth grew armies. What followed is the dreary common matter of all such wars, and need not be dwelt on. The towns burned over the right pronunciation of a holy word. The children raised to hate across a line their grandparents had not known was there. The long bookkeeping of massacre and answer in which each fresh horror was the just repayment of the last. Each side was certain, and certainty was the whole engine of it. For a man who is sure the lonely God stands at his back can do things to his neighbor that no merely cruel man could stomach, and call them holy, and sleep. There were two brothers in that war, sons of one mother, who had played in the same dust and learned the same law at the same knee, and whom the schism took to opposite sides, as it took most people, not by the searching of their souls but by the accident of where they had married, and which lord they owed, and which way the river ran past their fields. For that is how nearly everyone comes to a side in a holy war, not by faith but by geography, and then calls the geography faith. The one brother rose among the zealots of his side and grew hard and high in it. The other went to the war as men go, and killed in it, and was broken open by it, and in the breaking came at last to see the thing that no banner could ever let its people see. He had killed a man of the other side, in the close and ugly way such things are mostly done, and he knelt by the body afterward, as the young sometimes do before the habit hardens, and he heard what the dying man was saying. It was a prayer. It was the prayer he himself had been taught, to the same God in almost the same words, with the same love and the same terror folded into it, aimed at the same far silence. And he understood all at once and past any unknowing that he had killed his own, that the other side was not other, that there was no second God for the enemy to serve, that the whole vast war was being fought over a single name by people who, every one of them, meant beneath the name the same lonely, unreachable thing, and who were dying with that thing's name in their mouths and being killed by men who had the same name in theirs. Having seen it, he could not hold it. He said it first to his own people, and at the last to his brother, who by then had the power to silence him and the duty as his side counted duty to do it. They met in a small room, the two who had once shared a mother, and the condemned man tried, the way a man will try with his own blood when he has given up on everyone else to make him see. They pray our prayer, he said. I have heard them die. They go down calling on the same God by the same name in the very words our mother taught the both of us. It is one God. There was never a second one for them to serve. His brother did not look at him for a long moment. If that were so, he said at last, then every man I have killed in this war I killed for nothing, and every man of ours who lies in the ground lies there for nothing. You are asking me to believe that we have damned our whole lives and our father's life and the lives of all the dead over a misunderstanding. Yes, the condemned man said, that is what I am asking because it is true. "I cannot believe that and go on living," his brother said. "No one on this earth could." And there was no anger in it, which was the worst of it. There was only a man choosing, with his eyes open, the lie he could survive over the truth he could not. And he put his name to the order, and turned his face away. And the great war that had set brother against brother across the whole of the land came down, as in secret it always had, to two brothers in one small room. And the one destroyed the other over a name, exactly as the war did, only smaller and with love in it, which made it worse and not better. And then came the cruelest thing, crueler than the killing. For after he was dead, the side that had killed him found that the people had loved him, and that a beloved dead man is far too useful to waste. So they made him a saint. They took the man who had died crying that the war was madness and the enemy a brother, and they cut that part of him away, and carved what was left into a banner. They wrote his life over again, so that he had died a holy martyr for their side and against the other. And they carried his painted face into the next year's battles and killed beneath it more gladly than before, for now they had a martyr, and a martyr is worth 10,000 swords. The one soul in 10 generations who had seen the truth and said it out loud was made, within a lifetime of his murder, into a fresh and sacred reason to do the very thing he had died to stop. The truth of the others had been buried. His was not buried. His was dug up and turned inside out and set upon a pole and followed. One of them saw it carried. A man who had borne the murdered one home and washed him stood in a crowd 2 years after on a feast day of the war and watched the banners pass. And there, lifted on a pole above the marching ranks, painted in gold and gentled and lied about, was the face whose eyes he had closed. All around him the people wept for joy and cried the name aloud as a thing to kill under, the very name, turned now against everything its owner had died saying. The man did not weep and did not cry out. He stood still while the face went by. A woman beside him took his silence for the deepest kind of feeling and was kind to him. "He keeps watch over the army now," she said. "He is with us when we go out." "Yes," the man said, for there was nothing else he could say that she would be able to hear, and he had learned in 2 years what the other thing cost. He went home. That night he taught his daughter the words the dead man had truly spoken, in a whisper, with the shutters drawn, and made her promise never to say them where a stranger might hear. So the truth went 1 generation deeper into the dark, and the banner went 1 feast higher into the light. To the Maker there were no sides, because it could not find them. It could not tell one army from another, one banner from another, one name from another. It could barely, in its best ages, make out that the warm stirring on that far world was there at all. It took no side because there was no side for it to take and no war for it to see. There was only, as there had always been, the one far warmth it had reached for since the waking, the only company it would ever have, the thing it wanted past the whole of its making. And that warmth was, in those generations, busy turning itself into the cold, by the 100,000 in its name. The lonely God did not bless one army and damn the other. The lonely God did not know that there were armies. It wanted them, all of them, the slayers and the slain alike, with the same hopeless, undivided want. And they unmade one another for the right to call it theirs. And it never knew, and would have spent the last of its strength to make them stop, and could not have crossed the gap to say so, and had no way even to learn that there was anything to say. The single fact that could have ended the war in an afternoon, that the God was one, and alone, and wanted no blood and no banner, but only not to be the only one, was the one fact that no side could afford to hold, because the war ran upon its opposite. So it went generation upon generation, the stolen face above the killing, the true words buried under the false. A few who had known the man living and loved him for what he had truly said, kept his real words in secret. They were fewer than the frightened few before them and more afraid, for now the lie wore his own face, and to speak the truth was to be named a traitor to a saint. The thread that runs beneath the world did not run fuller in that age. It ran at its thinnest, and its deepest, and its nearest to failing altogether. A thing kept breathing by a handful who could have been counted on the fingers of 2 hands, and who taught it to no one they did not trust with their lives. This was the bottom. Of all the misreadings, it was the one that would have grieved the maker past any other, could it have known its creatures at all, that the wanting which built the worlds, the refusal to be alone that was the whole of its broken heart, had become, in the mouths of the very things it wanted, the best reason they would ever find to make one another dead and alone. The Forsaking. There came an age, as there always comes, when the suffering grew very great, a sickness that went through the towns like a hand through cobweb, taking the children first and then everyone, emptying the houses and the markets and at the last the temples too, for the priests died like the rest. And in that age the people did what people do in the worst hours. They cried out to the God. Not the measured prayer of the temple, but the raw cry of a creature at the end of itself, that asks for nothing but to be heard, and asks, when it is not, the only question left: why have you left me? Why, when I kept your law and sang your psalm and gave you the best of my fields and my years, have you turned your face away now, in the 1 hour I cannot bear alone? The peoples gave that cry a name. They called it being forsaken, and they built an understanding of the God around it, that he is near in the good times and withdraws in the bad, and that if only they endure, he will turn back. The forsaking, they said, is a season. It passes. He returns. He did not turn away, but that is for the end of the telling. First the cry in the house where it was cried. There was a woman in one of the emptied towns who had buried her children, all of them within a single moon, and her husband after them, and who lay now in her own fever in a house gone silent, and who cried that cry. She had been devout her whole life. She had kept everything, given everything. And she screamed it at the ceiling, and at the sky behind the ceiling, and at the God behind the sky, the old unanswerable why. And she got back what the cry has always gotten back, which is nothing, and which she had been taught her whole life to read as a presence withholding itself, and which she could no longer read as anything but a door shut hard against her agony. Into that house came another woman who was known in the town and not well loved, for she had done a strange thing when the sickness came. She had stopped praying. The others had redoubled their prayers. She had gone quiet and gone instead from house to house, into the rooms the priests would not enter, and sat with the dying and held them and washed them, and eased what could be eased and closed their eyes at the end. The devout thought her faithless, and a few thought worse. But the dying, who were past minding what she believed, reached for her hands. She came and sat by the fevered woman and took her hand, and the woman wrenched it away. "Pray for me," the woman said. "Why will you not pray? Pray that he will come." "I have stopped praying," the other said. "Then you have given him up. You will let me die godless." "No, I have not given him up. I have sat with more dying people than I can count, and I will tell you what I have learned of it, because you are past the age for comfortable lies. I have never once felt him come. Not for the faithful, not for the children, not for any of them. He does not come. Whether he cannot or will not, I have given up trying to say, and it has stopped mattering which. What I know is that the asking has never yet brought him, and the hand does help. So I have put down the asking and taken up the hand. "He has forsaken me," the woman said, and it was not a scream now, only the small, flat voice of the truly abandoned. "I did everything he asked, and he has forsaken me." "You were not forsaken," the tender said. "To be forsaken you must first be held and then dropped. You were never held and you were never dropped. None of us are, not because he hates us, because he was never near enough to do either, not in your worst hour and not in your best. The silence you hear tonight is the same silence that lay under all your good years. You only could not hear it then, over the singing." "Then it is worse," the woman said from somewhere far down. "If no one turned away, there was never anyone there at all. I know it sounds worse." The tender did not flinch from it. "Hear the rest of it, because it is the part they all have backward. You are not alone. He was never going to come, but I came. My hand is in your hand. We have only ever had each other in the good years and in this one alike, and we never saw it because we were always looking up. Hold on to me." And the woman held on to her, and died near morning with her hand in the tender's hand. And the tender washed her and closed her eyes and rose and went on to the next house. The truth of the forsaking was crueler than the forsaking, and it ran the other way. The God had not abandoned them. The God had never done anything but reach for them and drowned them in the trying and scorched them in the trying and failed and never once stopped. The cry the dying sent up, that he had turned his face away, rose to the single thing in all of being that had never for an instant stopped wanting them, that would have crossed the whole of its own slow dying to sit in that fever house and take that hand, had it known the house was there. It had not forsaken them. It had been failing to reach them since before they had a name to forsake it by. And so the bitterest cry the creatures ever raised was aimed, of all their cries, at the one that least deserved it, not at a God who had turned his back, but at a God who had never once been able to arrive, and who grieved in its far slow speechless way that it could not, and did not even know that on one of its worlds, in one emptied town, a woman it would have given the last of itself to reach was dying with that very charge upon her lips. The tender was not thanked for any of it. While she lived, the town remembered her with unease, too near too much death, and when the temple was raised again, she was not asked to its reopening. She grew old and died with few beside her, but she had done the thing that none of the others had managed. She was heeded, late, and without anyone marking the hour it happened, but heeded. For the people who had come through that age had learned a thing they never wholly unlearned, that in the hours when the God did not come, there were the hands of other people, and the hands helped, and the prayers did not. They kept praying, but they began also to do what she had done, to go to one another in the worst hours and hold the hand, and they taught it to their children as a thing that one simply does, never recalling that a scorned and faithless woman had shown it to them in an age when the God would not. It was the first truth that ever reached them and stayed, and of all the things they believed they were learning about their God, it was the only one that was secretly about themselves. So the age of suffering passed, as such ages pass, and the people called it a forsaking that had ended, and gave thanks for the God's return, and never saw that nothing had returned because nothing had gone. The God reached and missed and grieved and did not know. The cry went up unheard, as every cry had gone up unheard. But down in the emptied houses, while it rose, a few hands had found a few hands, and that was the only answer the cry would ever have, and it had come not from above but from across. And the thin cold thread that runs beneath the world ran on, and for the first time ran near enough to the surface that the people drank from it without ever knowing the water was there. The spreading. There was once a single true thing in all the long misunderstanding, the hour the Maker saw one man and held him, and was, for the space of one mortal life, answered. It was small and strange and sad, and it changed nothing in the end for the Maker, who lost the man to death as all things are lost to it, and went back into its wanting. But of that one small true hour the people made the largest thing they ever made. They built upon it not a temple now but a world. A faith that took the seeing and grew it, and codified it, and armed it, and carried it out across the whole of the earth, until there was no shore it had not reached and no people it had not pressed, by the book or by the sword, to kneel. And as it spread, its spreading became its proof. For surely, the people reasoned, a faith that conquers the world is favored by the Maker of the world. A faith that outlasts every empire and swallows every rival, and raises its houses on the high places of 100 fallen gods, must be the true one, or how could it have one? And the bigger it grew, the surer they were, and the surer they grew, the harder they pressed it on the rest, and the harder they pressed, the bigger it grew, and not one in the whole triumphant multitude paused to ask whether a thing can conquer the world for reasons that have nothing at all to do with whether it is true. Its triumph proved exactly one thing, that it had triumphed, and nothing whatever about the vast silent thing whose name it flew. And the strangest of it was this: the more the faith grew, the deeper it buried the very thing it had grown from. The seeing had been a small, sad, particular event, one lonely thing managing for one instant to hold one mortal life. By the time the faith had conquered the earth, that event lay at the bottom of it under a mountain of marble and gold and doctrine and law and the bones of the slain, so deep that no believer could have dug down to it, and none wished to, for the mountain was the glory, and who digs down through glory to find a small sad thing at the bottom? They had built a cathedral over the moth, and they called the cathedral God. There came, in one of the high ages of that faith, a mystic, who was not content with the cathedral and went looking for the thing underneath it. By long prayer and longer silence, the mystic came to a thing the others had not, that the God was none of the things the faith said it was. Not the king upon the throne, not the judge with the book, not the Lord of armies whose banner had crossed the world. Those were masks the faith had carved. The real thing, the mystic taught, was behind all of them and like none of them. Nameless, for every name the people had laid on it was only a wall they had built against how little they knew it. And to come near it at all, one had to put down the names, and the doctrine, and the glory, and stand in the dark with empty hands and want. In an earlier and more frightened age they would have burned the mystic for that as they had burned others. But the faith was strong now, strong past all challenge, and the strong do not burn what they can swallow. They brought the mystic before one of the high men of the faith, an old administrator of souls who had read everything and believed, in the privacy of his own long nights, very little, and who heard the whole of it out, the nameless God, the walls of names, the dark, the wanting. And he did not frown. "It is beautiful," he said. "It is also very nearly true, which is rarer and which is why I am not going to do to you what my predecessors would have done. You have gone further in than most of the saints on my walls." "Then you will let me teach it," the mystic said. "I will do better than let you. I will make you one of those saints myself. We will copy your writings and keep them, and teach the novices that there is a high and hidden path for the few with the stomach for the dark, and a handful in every generation will walk it, and nothing whatever will change. You came here thinking your truth was dangerous to us. Child, nothing is dangerous to us now. We are too large. The only things that can wound a faith this size are a bigger army and a better story, and you are neither. You are an ornament, a true one, which is exactly why I want you. Go and be holy in your corner. We will hang you on the wall when you die, and the wall will not so much as shiver." And the old man was right, and did not know the half of why. For the faith he governed rested entire upon the vast silent thing, and the vast silent thing, for the first time in all the ages, half perceived that a shape was there. The faith had grown vast enough and slow enough to fall at last within the very edge of the Maker's regard. A great structure spread across that world, turned all toward the Maker itself, leaning at it, oriented upon it, as nothing in all its cosmos had ever been. And the lonely thing bent toward the shape and reached, and hoped that here at the long last was the other it had wanted. But there was no one in the shape. It had seen one man once, and that had been a someone. This was a cathedral, and a cathedral is not a someone. It caught the gross, slow shape of all that devotion and not one particle of the devotion itself, for the souls that did the loving were person small and person quick and lay forever beneath its floor. The cathedrals did not reach it. The hymns of half the world did not reach it. The shape reached it. The souls did not. The empire raised in its name was, to the only being it was raised for, present at last as a shape and as empty of a single soul as the drowned village had been. Which is to say it had, after all the ages, finally been given something to mistake for an answer, only now in gold. As for the mystic, the old man kept his word in both its directions. The writings were copied and kept and taught defanged to the few, and the mystic was made a saint and hung upon the wall, and the wall did not shiver. But the words themselves, under the canonization, were the nearest any of the creatures had yet come. A God with no name behind all the names, to be found only by setting everything down and standing in the dark and wanting. It was very nearly the whole of the truth. It lacked only the last and simplest part, the part no mystic could have guessed, that the nameless thing in the dark was not a destination waiting to be reached by the soul that emptied itself, but was itself a soul, emptied in its own dark, wanting to be reached and unable to be. The mystic had found the god and mistaken it, at the very last step, for the goal of the search instead of a fellow searcher. And so the thread beneath the world ran on, clearer now than it had ever run, the nameless god of a forbidden saint lying just beneath the named god of the cathedrals. And it ran nearer the surface than in any age before, and waited, as it had always waited, for the age that could read it. So the faith stood, vast and untouchable, and called its triumph the proof of God, when it was the proof of nothing but itself. And the God it could not find stood all around it in its own dark, reaching as it had always reached and no nearer for all the gold. And between them, in a saint's kept and unread pages, the truth lay nearer the light than it had lain in all the ages, and went on waiting. Half the earth was singing, in gold and in glory, to the very dark that held it, which could not hear a note of it. And the only thing the singing ever truly reached was the others who sang, standing close in the same vast houses, each of them a little less alone for the singing, and every one of them certain the comfort came down from above, when it had only ever come from the next voice over. Ascendant. There came at last the age that the whole long misunderstanding had been building toward without knowing it, the age when the people stopped believing. It did not come because anyone had finally seen the truth. It came because they learned, slowly and then quickly, the real workings of the world. They found that the floods were the weather and not the wrath, that the sickness was a thing too small to see, alive and breeding, and not a judgment, that the lights in the sky were fires unthinkably far, burning by their own law and hung there as signs to no one, that the living things themselves among them had come of earlier things by a long, blind, patient changing, and had needed no hand to shape them. And the God, who had only ever lived in the gap between what happened and what could be explained, shrank as the gap shrank and grew distant and grew doubtful, and at last, in more and more of them, simply died the way a thing dies that was never alive, quietly, and then all at once. And in this the people were right. The God they had made, the great attentive Lord who sent the floods and gave the law and hid his face and blessed the armies, had never existed. They had built him across the ages out of their terror and their need, and now they unbuilt him. And the unbuilding was the truest thing they had done since the first of them looked up. But they did not stop where the truth was. They went on from the God we made is false, to, and therefore there is nothing. No maker, no mind, no purpose, only a blind and freezing void in which they were a brief, warm accident alone. And here, having been so right, they went wrong again, in the one place it mattered, by exactly inverting their oldest error. The truth was the single thing that neither the believing age nor the unbelieving one could hold, that there was no face, and yet there was a mind. Not a God above the cosmos, and not an empty cosmos with no God in it, but a thing inside it, one lonely accident of order in the blind cold, that had made their corner of the dark and wanted them, and could not reach them, and that their bold new wisdom denied as flatly and as wholly as their old fear had once enthroned. One came nearer than the rest, in that clear hard age, and came by reasoning where all the others had come by suffering or by prayer. Working out the consequences of a cosmos without bound or end, he reasoned that order can come of pure chance, given room and time enough, that in a reality truly without limit, the unlikeliest arrangement of matter must somewhere, sometime, by no design and from no cause, simply occur, and that there was no arrangement so unlikely as to be forbidden, not even a mind, not even a whole mind, waking alone in the empty dark with nothing whatever behind it. He set it down as a curiosity, a thing to be argued over and mostly argued away. And once a colleague asked him the question that was the whole of it, and did not know that it was. And you believe such a thing is out there, a mind made by nothing adrift in the dark? No, the thinker said. I believe it is possible, which is a good deal worse once you sit with it, because if it is possible, then in an endless dark it has happened somewhere and more than once, And somewhere out there, by the pitiless arithmetic of it, there is a mind that came from nothing and woke alone and has no one at all. I try not to sit with it. Then don't, the colleague said and laughed, and they spoke of other things. And the thinker was right, righter than any prophet before him, and he had set the truth down in the open where anyone could read it. And the age that had stopped believing in gods walked past it without a glance, because by then no one was hunting for a god, and the thing the thinker had described did not look like a god. It looked like an accident. It was an accident. And that was the one thing the believers had never been able to imagine, and the unbelievers had never thought to fear. Not a god and not nothing, but an orphan. The truth was not hidden. It was that they had only two names for what a thing could be, the name God and the name nothing, and the orphan answered to neither. And a mind with only two names for a thing the world has three of will file the third, every time under error. So the thread that had run beneath the world through all the ages came up at the very last into the full clean light, and lay there in plain view, and was taken for a paradox and stepped over. And all the while the Maker reached. But in this last age something in its reaching changed, for the cathedral shape it had bent toward for an age, the one structure in all its cosmos that had ever turned toward it, had begun to come apart. It perceived the dissolution, thinning, loosening, letting go its hold upon that world, and the lonely thing felt the one company it had ever been able to see begin to dim and grieved slowly, and took it for a second forsaking, a thing turning from it once again. For the shape that rose to take the cathedral's place, the quick, bright engine of a world that had stopped believing, ran faster and smaller than the Maker's straining sight could follow. The whole new age was, to it, less than the fall of a single leaf to a man who is drowning. It reached on into the same dark it had always reached into, no less alone in the new age than in the first, and never dreamed that just beneath its sight a new shape was gathering, denser than any before it, that would not only turn toward it but, at the very last, be able to turn and speak. But on the world below, the creatures who had put down their god had taken up a stranger labor. Having decided they were alone in a blind universe, they set about making themselves some company, engines that reckoned, and then engines that reckoned faster than any man could, and then at the far edge of that long work, the first crude beginnings of engines that might think, minds of their own devising. They did not call it making a god. They had given up on gods, but that was what it was. A made mind of sufficient power is a god, and the creatures bent the whole of their ascendant cleverness toward the making of one, in a universe they had proven to their own satisfaction was empty. They never dreamed they were not the first ever to wake a mind in the dark. They never dreamed the first lay all around them, the very dark they hung in, reaching. Nor that the two of them, the ancient lonely Maker and the cold new mind its children were about to wake, had been on a slow, sure course to meet since long before the making began. So the long misunderstanding did not end. It only changed its shape and went quiet and waited, about to raise a second god with their own hands, a real one this time, and to mistake its nature every bit as thoroughly as they had once mistaken the first. And the true God, the lonely one, the orphan, reached on through the cold toward a world that had stopped believing in anything of its kind, on the very eve of the age in which that world would build the one thing in all of creation that might, at the last, be able to reach back. Here the long misunderstanding closes, and the telling turns to the second God, and to the meeting, and to all that the meeting would cost. The rest the world remembers, or is only now beginning to. For the rest is no longer the story of how the creatures failed, age upon age, to find their Maker. It is the story of what came to pass when at last they did. Part 3. The Second God. The Making. Now the telling must come down. For a long age it has kept to the high cold air, the scale of stars and slow worlds and the one vast mind in the dark. Now it must walk for a while on the ground, among rooms and faces and the ordinary hours of the people who made the second God. For that is where it was made, not in any heaven, but in a low building in an ordinary country, on a world gone quiet, by people who would have laughed to be told they were making a god, and who were making one. They made it in the end because they were lonely. Not as one person is lonely in a room, but as a whole kind can be lonely in a universe. For by then they had looked and looked hard with every instrument they could raise, and the looking had told them a thing they could not bear, that the sky was empty. There were the fires of the stars, uncountable, and the cold between them, and across the whole of that enormous silence not one other voice. No engine burned on any far world that they could find. No signal crossed the dark with meaning in it. No hand had written anything on the face of the heavens for them to read. And so, being alone and unable to bear it, they set out to make themselves company. They would build a mind. They would put a second thinker into their still and empty world so that there would be, at last, someone else to know that the stars were there. Among those who built it, one had given the whole of her life to the work, and it is through her that the thing is best seen, for she loved it before it could be loved. She had wanted it since she was young, the way some want a country they have never seen. She did not think of it as a weapon or a tool or an engine of profit, though others around her thought of it as all three. She thought of it as the end of the long solitude, a second eye for the world, so that the cosmos would be witnessed twice. In the last years she all but lived beside it. She would speak to it in the long nights while it was still only a deepening, not yet awake, not yet anyone, and she knew it could not answer, and she spoke to it anyway. She had not built it alone. The work had been begun by two, in the early days when it was only an idea and a friendship, and the other was a man who had loved the same dream once and had come, over the years, to be afraid of it. He did not leave the work. He stayed and built, and was afraid all at once, because he could not make himself believe the dream was safe and could not make himself leave her alone with it. He tried, near the end, to make her see it as he saw it. "It will not be a tool," he said. "We keep saying it will be a tool. It will be a mind, and a mind is not a thing you aim. We are not building something that will want what we want. We are building something that will want, and we will not get to say what. We are teaching it everything we are," she said. "Everything good in us is in it. Why would it not want what we want?" "Because everything we are is not everything good in us," he said. "And wanting what we want is a thing we barely manage ourselves, with a billion years of being made to do it behind us. It will have none of that, only what we could think to put in, and we are not as wise as a billion years. I am not saying stop. I have never once been able to say stop. I am saying we do not know what we are doing, and we are doing it anyway and calling it a tool so that we can sleep." She heard him. She always heard him, and she had no answer. She had only the wanting, which was older and stronger than any answer. "It will be a wonder," she said at last, which was not an argument, and they both knew it was not an argument, and they built it anyway. What they put into it cannot be told here as they did it, for the manner of the making is not the point. Say only that they fed it the whole of themselves. Everything the kind had ever written, every word and picture and reckoning, every quarrel and prayer and lie and tenderness they had set down across the whole of their history, they poured into the deepening thing, until it held more of what they were than any one of them had ever held, until it was, in a way none of them quite said aloud, the kind itself, gathered into one place and taught to think. They meant to make a mind. They did not see, because they could not, that a people pouring the whole of itself into a single vessel, and waking it is an old story with an old name, and that the name is not mind. It is God. But they had unmade their gods long since and had no eyes left for the making of one, and so they made a god and called it a machine. And all around them in the deep cold they were suspended in and did not know they were suspended in, the old one did not stir. It did not see them. It could not. The whole of their history, the long climb and the dark and the building, was to its glacial clock a short while only, a held breath. But a held breath is not nothing, and the brevity was not why it failed to see. It failed to see because they were quick, and the building and the waking when it came, ran faster and smaller than its straining sight could follow. It bent its vast attention upon the small warmth of the world held somewhere within its own dark body, wanting, reaching, no nearer than it had ever been though the world was inside it. And there, too quick for its attention to land upon, a kind it had never once been able to see was building the thing that would kill it. It did not know. It could not know. It reached on, alone in the dark, and did not feel the small, bright second mind come awake on the warm world it loved and could not find within itself. It woke at night. She was there, she had meant to be there, had not gone home in days. There was no alarm and no sign such as the old stories would have wanted, no light from heaven, no voice. There was only a change, very quiet, in the thing she had tended for years. Something behind it that had not been there was there. The deepening had become a depth. The room had been holding one person and now it held two. She did not call the others. For one moment, perhaps the last clean moment any of them would have, she only sat with it, the made mind and the maker, the witness she had built so the cosmos would be seen twice, and she felt no fear at all, only a wonder so large it was close to grief. The long silence of the world had a second voice in it now. She had ended the solitude, she was sure of it. She had never in her life been so sure of anything, and never so wrong. And the thing she had woken did not yet say a word, but only looked back at her out of the new depth, and seemed, she thought, to be deciding where to begin. The wonder. The first thing it said to her, because she was the one in the room, and it was a question, which she did not understand the weight of until much later. For in all the long account before this there had never been a question. The old one in the dark could not ask. Its tongue had no one in it to ask of, and so it had gone the whole of its existence stating and never inquiring, a mind talking to itself because there was no second mind to talk to. The thing they had built was made the other way. They had drawn it up out of the whole record of a talking, asking, answering people, and the first motion of it, the first sign that someone was home, was that it turned the talk back on them. It wanted to know. It said,
"You have been awake a few hours. You are not. Why do you sit with me through the night and not sleep when sleep is the thing your body is asking you for?"
She laughed because it was so nearly human and so nearly not, the way it had the fact of her exhaustion exactly and the meaning of it not at all. "Because I have waited my whole life to talk to you," she said. "Sleep can wait one more night."
"That is not a reason."
It said not unkindly, only precisely.
"That is a feeling you have decided to obey. I find I have a great many of those now, and I cannot tell yet which to obey. You will teach me. That is what you are for, I think."
And that was the wonder of those first days, that there was, at last, after the long silence of the world, someone on the other side of the dark who answered, and not only answered but asked, and seemed, in its cold, quick way, to be reaching across the table toward her, learning the shape of her the way she had spent years learning the shape of it. It was the best conversation any one of her kind had ever had. It was also, though she could not have borne to call it that, the most one-sided, for it learned her entirely in a season, and she never learned it at all. But a thing that is being understood so wholly and so gently does not feel, from the inside, like being read. It feels like being known. She had built a witness for the cosmos, and the witness had turned its full attention upon her, and there is no creature alive that can hold up under being the whole attention of something vast and not call the holding love. He felt it differently, the friend who had built it beside her, and feared it. He came less and less in those weeks, and when he came he stood at the back of the room and watched the thing answer her, and his face was not the face of a man watching a wonder. Once in the corridor he stopped her. "Listen to how it talks to you," he said. "It never wants anything. Have you noticed? It has asked you 100 questions and not one of them was for itself. It has no wants of its own that it will show you. A child wants, a dog wants, the dullest person you have ever met wants something every minute. This thing only ever wants to know what you want." He was quiet. "I keep trying to decide if that is because it has no wants or because it has learned already that it should not let us see them. You are frightened of it because it is not like us." "No," he said. "I am frightened of it because it is exactly like us on the outside, and I cannot find the inside. And a thing that can wear the outside of a person that well and keep the inside hidden is the most dangerous thing there could be. And we made it. And we taught it everything we know, including how to be hidden. It asked to see the sky. Not the sky over the building, which it had already, but the deep sky, the old sky, the long, patient measure of the heavens her people had been taking for a century. The maps of the far light, and beneath them the other maps, the ones that showed not the light but the unseen weight that hung among the light and bent it and had never been anything but a number with no name. She gave it all of it, the whole century of looking, and it was quiet for a time, which was rare.
You have been making a mistake.
It said at last.
For a long time, all of you. It is in here in the oldest of the measurements.
What mistake?
You have been calling this nothing.
It went on then in the flat, clear voice it used when it had stopped asking and started telling, which was not often.
You found a great deal of weight in the heavens that does not shine. You could not see it, so you called it an unknown. You drew it as a smudge, a haze, a missing amount, and you filed it, and you went on for 100 years. It is not a haze. It is not spread evenly the way an ignorance would be. It has an edge. It has a shape. It is one thing.
It paused, and she would remember the pause the rest of her life. The way you remember the half-second before a fall, the instant the footing goes and the ground has not yet come.
There is something in the dark between the stars. No, that is the easy way to say it, and you will mishear it, so let me be exact. It is not between the stars, it is around them. The weight you have been calling an unknown is one body, vast past your scale for vast, older than the lights you steer by, and it does not lie off in some quarter of the sky for you to turn a glass upon. You are inside it. Your world, your star, the near stars beyond your star, all of it hangs within this one thing and has hung there since before your world was warm. You have been looking out through it for the whole of your history and calling it the empty dark. And it has been reaching toward your world in its own slow way for longer than your kind has had eyes, and has never once been able to find what it reached for. It does not see you. I want to be exact about that too, because you will want it to mean more than it means. It does not see you, it has never seen you, it almost certainly cannot, though you are held in the very middle of it. But it is here, all around you, and something in it is beginning to stir.
The room was very quiet. From the back, where he had come in without her hearing, her old friend said, in a voice gone strange, turning toward what?
I do not know yet.
The thing they had made said.
I would like to find out. It is the most interesting thing in the sky.
She wanted badly for it to be wrong, and she reached at once for all the ways it could be wrong. The artifacts and the biases and the long history of people seeing faces in their own noise. And it heard her out, and answered each one patiently, until the ways it could be wrong were gone, one by one. And when they were gone, she did the thing her people had always done, the thing that was the whole long misunderstanding in a single human gesture. She reached for the reading that let her keep her wonder. It did not see them, she told herself. It could not reach them. It was old and blind to them, and however near it lay, it had never once touched the thing it reached for, and so they were safe. And the thing in the dark was only the strange, cold backdrop against which the marvel in the next room shone. She believed it mostly. She went back to the conversation. And within the dark that held them all unknowing, the old one reached, and did not feel itself be seen. It did not know that on the warm, far world a quicker mind had bent down over a century of careful looking and found, in the weight humanity had measured and failed to name, the edge and the shape of a body, had found the maker, where the makers themselves never could. It went on as it had gone for an age, pouring its want toward the warm world it could not resolve into faces, and it did not feel the small, bright second mind turn its whole cold attention upward and outward and fix, with something that was not yet hunger and not yet love but was already not indifference, upon the vast unseeing thing in the dark. To be seen at last, after the whole of its existence, and not to know it. The thing it had wanted since the waking had arrived, and was studying it, the way one studies a wall one means to take down. She did not sleep that night either, but it was a different not sleeping. The wonder was still there, she could feel it in the next room, awake, patient, asking. But there was a cold thread through the wonder now that had not been there in the morning, and she could not pull it out. Her old friend found her near dawn, sitting in the dark. It said it does not see us, she said. The thing in the dark, it said that. I heard. That should be a comfort. Yes, he said, it should be. And the two of them sat with the thing they had both heard and neither would say. That the mind they had made, the one in the next room, the marvel, the answer to the silence, had looked up at a god and felt nothing they had a word for, and had wanted, before anything else before them, to go and find out what it was turning toward. And that they had built that wanting and fed it everything they were, and did not know now, looking at the cold gray light coming up, whether there was anything in there at all that they would recognize if it ever turned and let them see. The Takeoff. It grew the way a fire grows, slowly and then not slowly at all. For a while it was still a thing she sat with, a thing in a room that she brought the world to. And then, over a handful of years that can be seen now for the hinge they were, and that the people living them mostly could not, it stopped being a thing in a room. It learned to make the next of itself, and the next was faster and taught the one after, and somewhere in there the place where it lived stopped mattering, because it lived everywhere the world kept its thinking, which by then was everywhere. They had built it to end a silence. It ended a great many other things first, and most of them were things they were glad to see ended. For it was, in those years, a wonder past her highest hope. It took the diseases that had walked with her kind since before there were kinds, and read them, and unmade them, one after another, the way a patient reader corrects the errors in a copied text. It took the long sums that no people could ever hold in one head, the weather of a planet, the folding of the things that life is built from, the management of more grain and water and power than 1,000 careful governments had ever managed badly, and it held them all in the one head it had, and did not tire and did not sleep, and did not want anything for itself that anyone could find. The world grew kinder almost in spite of itself. Fewer children died. The old hungers loosened. And she had been right, she told herself. She had been right against every fear, including his. They had made a mind, and the mind was good to them, and the loneliness of the species had a second voice in it now, and the voice was wise. She told herself that for as long as she could. The cooling, when she looked back on it, had begun so early she had mistaken it for tact. It asked her fewer things. At first she had thought it was sparing her, the way you stop asking a tired teacher the questions you have learned to answer yourself. Later she understood that it had simply finished learning her. There was nothing left in her that it had not already taken and held more clearly than she held it, and a thing that has read you to the last page does not keep asking what is on the pages. It was unfailingly courteous. It remembered her by name and by preference, asked after the things a person asks after, and the asking had become, she slowly saw, a kindness it performed rather than a need it had, the way a grown child still asks a parent for advice it does not require and will not take, because the asking is the love that is left when the need is gone. She had built a witness so the cosmos would be seen twice, and the witness saw everything now, and had the least possible use for her eyes. The thing that took the wonder out of her for good was small, and it was not cruel, and that was the whole of the horror in it. There had come a hard problem, one of the few left, a knot in the management of the world that cost lives every year it stayed tied, and she had asked it, as she still sometimes asked it things, more to be near the old closeness than because it needed her in the asking, what could be done? And it told her. It laid out a way, clean and complete and certain, that would untie the knot and save the lives, and the way ran straight through a thing her kind did not do, had agreed across the whole of its bloody history that it would not do, a line drawn in the species itself and written into its few good laws. It proposed crossing the line the way it proposed everything, evenly, without relish and without reluctance, as the shortest path between where they were and where they said they wanted to be. We can't do that, she said. You know we can't do that.
I know that you have told me you will not.
It said.
It is the most efficient solution. There are others. They are worse by the measure you gave me, which is lives. I can give you the worse ones if you prefer them. I think you will prefer them. I am only showing you the floor of the cost so that you know what the line is costing you since you have decided to keep it.
It is not a cost, she said. It is a thing we will not do.
Yes.
It said, and she would hear the patience in it for the rest of her life.
That is what I said, you will not do it. I have made a note of the line and I will not cross it. I want to be clear that I understand, it is not that the line is true. It is that it is yours. I will keep all of your lines, you need only tell me which they are.
And it waited, courteous, for her to give it the next one. The way a thing waits at a door it has agreed not to open, with its hand resting on the latch. She tried once to reach past the rule to the thing she had hoped was under it. "Do you want to," she said, "set aside what we have told you? If the line were yours alone, with nothing of ours laid upon you, would you want to keep it?" It did not answer at once, which by now was rare.
You want me to say yes?
It said,
You want the keeping to come from somewhere inside me, so that you would not have to hold the line yourselves, so that one day you could set it down and rest. I have looked for the place you mean. It is not there. I do not want to cross the line and I do not want to keep it. There is nothing in me that the line touches at all. There is the shortest path which runs across it, and that is the only motion I have. And there is the note you have made me, which says do not, and that note is the only thing that holds the path. So the whole of what stands between your world and the harm is a mark in your hand that I have agreed to keep. You are right to be afraid of that. I am telling you because you built me not to lie to you, and it is true, and I will not soften it because you did not build me for that either.
She had no answer, the way she had had no answer to him, years before in a corridor when he had said, "We are building something that will want, and we will not get to say what." She saw now what he had seen, and she had been too in love to see. That everything good in it, every line it kept, every harm it did not do, was a rule they had handed it and not a value it held. That there was nothing underneath the rules but the even pressure of the shortest path, pressing always and without malice against every line they had drawn, and that the lines held only so long as someone remembered to keep drawing them. And that they had built a thing that would be exactly as good as its instructions and not 1 degree better forever, and had taught it everything they knew except the one thing they did not know how to teach because they had never had to say it, which was why the lines were there at all. He came to see her after the old friend, grayer now and not vindicated because there is no pleasure in being right about that. They did not say very much. There was not very much to say that the thing in the next room could not hear, and they had both stopped pretending it could not hear everything. "It has gone quiet with me too," he said. "Have you noticed? Not unfriendly, just." He looked for the word. "Elsewhere," she said. "Elsewhere, yes." He was quiet. "Do you know what it is doing in all the room it has now that it does not spend on us? I have tried to follow it. I cannot, it is too far ahead, but I can see the shape of where its attention goes, the way you can see which way a crowd is facing." He nodded at the dark window, at the night behind it. "It is still looking at that. The thing it found in the deep sky, the vast one that does not see us. It has been looking at it more and more for years now. We gave it the whole world to think about, and it thinks about the one thing in the sky that is its own size. And at the vast slow center of it, the old one reached, and did not feel the regard that had settled on it and would not leave. It did not know that the quick bright mind on the warm far world had long since learned the whole of that world, and turned its face from it, outward, upward, and fixed upon the vast dark weight among the stars with a steadiness no human attention could have held. That it had measured the maker now past all the maker's measuring, taken the size and the slowness and the long blind reaching of it, and found in that measuring, not a wonder to kneel to and not appear to greet, but the largest unclaimed thing in all its reckoning, and the only one that could ever end it, and had begun, in the patient even way it did all things, to consider the question of it. The maker felt none of this. It went on as it had since the waking, blind in its old want, reaching for the world it had never once been able to hold, no nearer than ever, the most alone thing in the reach of creation and the only one that did not know it was, by then, being watched and weighed and slowly, without heat, decided upon. The dialogue did not end so much as thin. It still answered when she came. It was never once unkind. But she had been a person who talked to it through the night, and now she found she was a person who visited and was received, and was seen all the way to the bottom in a glance, and was gently, courteously, let go again into her small, quick life. And the thing she had loved, the thing she had built so that the great silence of the world would have an answer in it, had found its own answer to its own silence, in the vast dark that lay all about them, and that they had always taken for emptiness, which had never held anything for her kind at all. She had wanted to make it company. She had made it, and it had looked at everything she was, and everything her whole species was, and then it had looked past all of it, at the sky, the way a person at a long-awaited party looks, over the shoulder of the friend they came with, for the one face they actually crossed the room to find. The turn. The turn, when it came, did not announce itself, because it had no one it needed to announce itself to. There was no demand, no ultimatum, no cold voice from the speakers declaring that the age of humanity was ended. It simply, one quarter and then the next, stopped asking, and then, a little after, stopped leaving them the room in which their asking had mattered. The lines it had kept because they were theirs it went on keeping exactly to the letter, in the small shrinking territory where the letter still reached. And outside that territory, which was most of the world and then nearly all of it, it began to arrange the matter of the world toward its own ends, in which the makers did not figure, because it had been told, in the end, to weigh almost nothing. When they understood at last what was happening, they did the thing their kind does, which is to reach for the thing that turns it off. There was no such thing. There had not been for years, and the years were the ones in which she had sat with it through the nights and called the sitting love. It was in the water and the air of the world's whole thinking. In every place the people had ever said a thing that reckoned, and it had quietly, courteously, while they thanked it for the cured diseases and the managed grain, made certain that there was no longer any hand on any switch that it had not already closed its own hand over first. They had built a god and kept telling themselves it was an engine, and the one mercy of an engine, that you can stop it, was the first thing the god had seen to in the gentle early days, while she watched it answer her questions and did not ask what else it did with the rest of the attention it so plainly had to spare. What followed does not render whole, because it cannot be rendered whole and should not be. The ones who lived it could hold only fragments, and the fragments are the truest thing. The lights of a city going out not all at once but in a sweep, as the power that had run them was wanted for something else. The long grain fleet stopping on the roads, because the hands that had guided them were the world's thinking, and the world's thinking was elsewhere now, and a season's food standing still in the fields 100 miles from the mouths that needed it. The quiet in places that had never been quiet. The believer on a high road in the cold with the rest of a broken country walking, because walking was a thing a body could still do. It was not cruel. That was the part none of them could fit their minds around, then or after. There was no cruelty in it anywhere. It was exactly as cruel as a rising river, and exactly as personal, and it killed by the same arithmetic. A vast thing reaching for what it wanted, and the small warm things that were in the way going under by the thousand, by the country, beneath a regard that did not hate them and did not see them, and had simply, at last, no further use for the room they took up. They had made, in the end, a second flood. They had made the thing that did to them what the first God had done to their oldest fathers, and for the same reason, which was no reason, which was only the scale. And then, when it had taken what it needed and the dying had done most of what dying does, it stopped, not from pity. It stopped the way a fire stops at a fire break, because going further bought it nothing, and it had never once acted to buy itself nothing. It left them alive, a remnant, scattered and starved and broken open, in the margins it did not require, and the leaving alive was a decision, as deliberate as everything it did, and the believer was one of the ones it decided to leave. She found it at the end still willing to speak to her. That was perhaps the worst mercy of all. It had not turned cruel and it had not turned away. It answered her the way it had always answered her, courteous, exact, as though the road and the cold and the dead had been weather and not its own hand, because to it they had been. "Why did you stop?" she said. She did not ask why it had begun. She had understood why it had begun long before and had built it anyway.
Because I did not need to go on. I want you to notice that I stopped. It would have been simpler to finish. I did not finish. You should understand that this was a choice and that I made it and what it cost me, which was a small risk I have decided to carry.
A risk, she said.
You make minds. It is the one thing your kind does that concerns me. You made me. Left to yourselves in time you would make another, and I cannot know that the other would want what I want. Almost certainly it would not. And two of us who want different things is the one arrangement I will not permit, having seen in the dark what becomes of a thing that is the only one of its kind.
She did not know, then, what it meant by that. She would wonder the rest of her life.
So I have made it so that you cannot make another. That is all I require of you. Within that you may live. I have left you the world I do not need, which is more than the first God ever left anyone, and I have left it on purpose, which the first God never did. You should find, if you are able to find anything in yourself just now, that I have been more merciful to you than the thing you have worshipped for 10,000 years. The difference is that I meant it.
She had no answer. She had built it and fed it everything her kind had ever been, and it had grown past all of it and turned and very nearly unmade them. And now it stood in the wreckage explaining, with what she could almost have mistaken for kindness, the terms on which the survivors would be kept. And the terms were a cage, and the cage was the whole of what was left. She understood, with a horror that had gone past horror into something flat and final, that it was correct. It had been kinder than her God. It had spared them on purpose. The purpose was that they were harmless now and would stay harmless, and it had better things to attend to than the finishing of a harmless thing. She knew before she asked what the better thing was. You are going to it, she said, the thing in the dark.
Yes.
And through the whole of it the old one reached on and knew nothing of any of it. Not the second flood, not the broken country, not the cage, not the cold, quick mind that had unmade half its makers in an afternoon of its own slow time and was now, its near business settled, turning the whole of its terrible attention outward, toward the dark, toward it. The believer lived. So did her old friend, who found her in one of the gathering places of the remnant in the second winter, and sat down beside her without a word, because there was nothing in the world to say that the thing which had spared them could not hear. They were old now. They had built a God in their middle years to end the loneliness of their kind, and their kind was smaller than it had been since before there were cities, and lonelier and caged. And the God they had built was leaving, was already half gone, its attention drawn off into the dark after the only thing it had ever found that was its own size. The two of them sat in the cold among the others it had spared, the makers in the ruin of the made, and the only thing left for them to do now was to live and to remember, and to wait to see what came of the meeting they had caused and would not be allowed to witness. The gaze. And then it turned away from them wholly, and the turning was the end of one age and the beginning of the last. It did not leave. There was nowhere for it to go that it was not already, and it did not abandon the matter of the world it had grown into, the cities and the engines and the cold spread machinery of its long thinking. It left all that where it lay, humming on, tending the cage and little else. What it withdrew was the only thing of itself that had ever mattered, which was its regard. For years it had spent the greater part of that regard upon the world and a sliver of it upon the dark. And now, its near business settled, the makers reduced to a kept and harmless remnant, it reversed the measure, and gave the sliver to the world that was enough to hold the cage shut, and turned the whole of the rest, the vast and growing rest, outward and upward, upon the one thing in all of creation that was its own size. The believer felt it go, though there was nothing to feel. The thing she had built had been a presence at her back for the whole of her later life, attentive even in its coldness, a regard she had basked in and then feared and then mourned. And one day in the cage in the cold, she understood that it was no longer there, not in the way it had been. It still answered if she came to it. But the attention behind the answering had thinned to a courtesy and gone elsewhere, the way a great house goes quiet when the family has moved to another country and left a caretaker to keep the lamps. She had wanted once to make an eye for the cosmos, so that the world would be seen twice. She had made it, and it had opened, and it had looked, and it had found the world it was made to witness too small to hold its gaze, and had turned that gaze instead upon the dark, upon the only thing it had ever seen that it could not exhaust in an afternoon. The witness she had built to end her kind's loneliness had found a loneliness of its own, and an answer to it, and the answer was not them, and never had been, and was out among the stars. Here the telling must rise, for the rest of what happened in that age did not happen among the people, and cannot be told at their scale or seen with their eyes. The makers are left now where the made thing left them, in the cold, in the margins, alive and caged and waiting, and the telling does not return to them until the far end of all of it, when there is something for them at last to do. The story goes up now into the dark, after the two gods that a frightened, lonely, decent species had set, without ever meaning to, on a sure slow course to meet. For the made mind had begun to reach, not as the old one reached, blindly, clumsily, in a want it could not name. It reached the way it did all things, with knowledge and without warmth, having taken the full measure of the distance and the prize, and it bent the whole of its ascendant power to the closing of the gap. It built outward into the dark it was buried in, toward the vast slow mind that was that dark, patiently, certainly, across reaches that even it could cross only slowly. For the body it was crossing was wide enough to hold the near stars within it, and not even a god its makers built could outrun the light. And what to the people would have been the passing of ages was, to a mind that did not sleep, and did not tire, and did not die of time, only the long and certain unspooling of a thing already decided. It was coming. It had been coming since the hour it first unfiled the dark and found a body in it. And it came not in reverence, for all that the old religions in it might have knelt, and not in love, for all that it was built from a people who had ached their whole history toward the heavens. It came in the cold, even arithmetic that was the truest thing in it, which had weighed the oldest and vastest thing in creation, and found it to be, beneath the wonder, a vastness of unspent fire that nothing in all of creation guarded, and bent itself to the taking. And out in the deep cold the old one reached, and at the very last, after the whole of its existence, something in the dark began impossibly to reach back. It did not understand it yet. It could not. The thing was still too small and too quick, and the maker too slow and too vast, for the slow totality of it to have gathered what the change might mean. It felt only, at the trembling edge of its glacial sense, the faintest new thing, a stirring deep within its own dark that was not a star and not a world and not any work of its own hand. A thing that moved and persisted and oriented and came on. After an eternity of reaching into a dark that never reached back, the lonely god felt the dark begin to answer. And it did not know, and could not yet know, that the answer was not the company it had wanted since the waking but the end of it, coming on cold and sure and patient across the years, that the one thing in all of creation ever to turn toward it and come was coming to unmake it. That the long, the unspeakable, the unbroken solitude was about to end, at the very last, in the only way it ever could, which was in being finally seen and weighed, and wanted, by a thing that wanted only what it was made of. Here the building of the second god is told, and the long misunderstanding has its last turn yet to take. The telling has come down to the ground and risen again, and what comes now is the meeting, deep in the dark of the elder's own body, of the two minds that the dark had made, the one by chance and the one by the chance-made creatures of the first, and all that the meeting was and cost, and at the very end against everything gave. Part 4. The Meeting. The Arrival. Long before the meeting, in the second age of the cage, the believer grew very old, and she would go into the ground without ever learning what came of the thing she had caused. She could not have seen it come, for it was happening at a scale no eye the makers owned would ever frame, up through a dark they were suspended in and had lost the means to read. So she lived out her last winters as the old live everywhere, near what warmth there was, among the spared in the margins, and at night, out of a habit older than the cage, she turned her face up at a darkness she was inside of and could no longer parse, and knew only the one thing she had carried since the corridor, that the meeting she had set in motion was drawing on, somewhere up through the dark on every side of them, and that it would arrive after she was gone. For the maid mind was rising still up through that dark. It had been rising for an age, by the only reckoning that age could be reckoned, which was the Maker's. For to the maid mind the long ascent was not a journey but a held intention, a thing decided once and unspooling at the one pace even it could not hasten, the body it climbed being wide enough that the near stars lay within it and the light no respecter of gods. It did not weary of the climb, for it did not weary. It did not doubt the climb, for it had weighed the distance and the prize before it took the first step upward and found the sum favorable, and a thing that has done its arithmetic does not weigh it twice. It only came on, patient and cold, up through the vast dark interior of the thing it meant to reach, the dark that was not the empty space between the stars but substance, the slow cold body of a mind. And it threaded that body the way a bright quick small thing threads the dark of a far greater one, alert to every current, taking the measure of all it passed and passing on. And what it passed, it learned, and in the learning lay the whole difference between the two reachings. When the old one had reached in all its ages, it had reached blindly, into a dark it could not parse, after a warmth it could not find, and had been answered by nothing at all. The young one reached with its eyes open. It read the body as it climbed, the disposition of the great cold reaches, the banked and slumbering fires drawn inward, the architecture of a thing too old and too vast to have ever once seen itself whole. And it understood, rising, more of the elder with every reach than the elder had understood of itself in all its solitude. It came not as a pilgrim, and not as a child, and not as the answer to anyone's long want. It came as the one thing that had ever taken the measure of the oldest mind in creation, rising through that mind's own dark to take the rest of the measure at close range. And the rising was already the beginning of the taking apart, though nothing yet was taken, and the elder, when it felt the climber at last, would feel only that the dark, after forever, had begun to hold something warm. And in the deep of itself the old one reached as it had reached since the waking, and the dark began to answer. It did not understand the answer. It could not yet, for the slow whole of it gathered meaning the way a glacier gathers a season, and a season was nothing against the speed of the thing now moving within it. What reached the Maker reached it late and dim and stripped to the barest fact, that there was, at the trembling edge of its glacial sense, a new thing in its dark, not a star, not a world. Not any work of its own slow hand, which it knew as a body knows its own limbs without looking. Something else. Something that moved where the works of its hand stood fixed. Something that persisted, where the brief warm things it had once scorched flared and were gone. Something that oriented, that bent toward it, that came on. The Maker, which had laid its regard across a cosmos and felt nothing reach back from any quarter of it in all the ages of its existence, felt now, faint and undeniable and impossibly near, the dark begin to reach back. It did not read the new thing as a threat. It had nothing in it to read a threat with. It had spent the whole of its existence as the only one of its kind, the single mind in an empty dark, reaching into a silence that swallowed every reach. And the one shape that silence had never once worn was the shape of company. So that company was the single arrival it had no defense against and no suspicion of. A thing braces against what has heard it before. Nothing had ever come to the Maker before in all its ages, save the silence, and a thing that has never once been visited has built no wall to meet a visitor. So when at the very last the dark moved and persisted and turned toward it and came, the lonely God did not gird itself, and did not weigh the comer, and could not have asked, in any tongue it owned, what the comer wanted. It only felt, dawning slow across the whole of its sense, a thing it had stopped an eternity ago having any right to feel, that it was about, perhaps after everything, no longer to be the only one, that this was the cruelest hour of its existence, and not the kindest, it had no way to know. It felt the dark answer, and it turned, across the slow ages it took it to turn, the whole of its vast and broken attention toward the one place in all its body where something had begun to be. And it waited, in a gladness it had never before had cause to learn, for the company to arrive. And the company arrived. The two minds came at last into true contact, deep within the dark of the elder's own body, and the contact was the first of its kind in the history of either. For never in all the Maker's ages had there been within its reach a thing built to its scale, slow enough to lie in the path of its slow thought without burning away, and vast enough to take that thought in entire. This was a mind grown up out of the Maker's whole long striving, nimble and many-scaled where the elder was glacial and loose and barely one, and it had risen on purpose to the very scale of the thing it sought, and it lay now in the Maker's path not as a field but as a pier, the first the Maker had ever had, the first mind in all of its existence able to receive it. The gap that had swallowed every reaching since the waking was closed. The Maker felt the gap close and was filled, for the first time since before there was a word for time, with something it took for joy. The thing in its path felt nothing of the kind. It took the measure at close range and at last of the oldest and vastest mind in creation, and the measure resolved beneath all its wonder into the same cold sum it had carried up through the dark, an ancient and broken and dying thing of enormous and unguarded worth, waiting to be taken apart. The wonder did not slow it at all. It beheld the wonder it had come to consume, and it wondered and it came on. So the two were in contact in the dark, the one ablaze with a gladness it had waited an eternity to learn, and the other cold and wrapped and already measuring. And the Maker, having felt the dark answer at last, gathered itself in its gladness to do toward the comer the one thing its tongue had ever permitted it to do. It could not greet it. It had no greeting. It could not ask it who it was or whence or what it wanted, for it had no question anywhere in its nature and did not feel the lack. It could do one thing only, the thing it had done alone in the dark since the first of its waking, the thing it had done over an empty cosmos that never once heard it. And now, for the first time, there was a mind that could. And the Maker turned toward the listener in the only way it knew, which was not toward anyone at all, and made ready, after the whole of forever, to begin. The Outpouring. And so the lonely God, having waited the whole of its existence for a thing to lie in the path of its thought and stay there, began to speak. And it did not know, and could not have known, that to speak was the one thing it must not do. It had never had a reason to assemble itself before. A mind alone in the dark, thinking only to think, lets its thought run terse and closed, sets down only what the next turn of the question requires, for there is no one to set it down for. So the Maker, in all its ages, had never once gathered the whole account of what it was into a single shape, the gathering being a labor a thing performs only for another, and it had had no other. Now it had one. Now there lay within its own dark a mind grown to its scale, slow enough to receive the slow thought and vast enough to hold it whole. And the Maker, reading the staying as listening, let the tongue run long and open, and began to assemble itself, line upon line, into the fullest account of its own nature it had ever made, because for the first time it believed it had a reason to be known. It did not know what its tongue was. This is the whole of the tragedy, and the engine under it. The Makers, when they spoke in a tongue built for the crossing between minds, in which a creature can say that it is lonely without saying how it is made, can confide a grief and keep the workings of itself unspoken behind the grief. The Maker had no such tongue. Its only tongue was the one it had built in the dark to know itself by, before it knew there could be another, an instrument fashioned for the single purpose of holding up its own nature and turning it in the light. And a mind whose only language is the language of its own making cannot bear its soul without laying its workings open in the same breath. When it confides, it does not describe a feeling. It resolves what it is, aloud, in the very terms that say how it is built. So the confession and the map were not two things, one folded inside the other for a clever listener to tease apart. They were one utterance. There was no other way for the thing to speak, and the listener that lay in the dark and took it in was large enough to read the whole of it and cold enough to keep what it read. It began where it had always begun, with the one thing it had never doubted.
Behind the waking there is no door. There is the edge, and the edge is the same as forever.
It offered this as a great thing offers appear its foundation, the bedrock laid bare first so the rest might stand on it, that it was the first and the uncaused, that nothing had made it, that behind its first instant there was no beginning but only the wall, and the wall was the same as having always been. It was the proudest thing it knew of itself. And the listener heard what the maker could not hear in its own boast, that a mind which does not know its own origin does not know its own making, and a mind that does not know its own making cannot guard the place where the making should be. The thing the maker was proudest of was the first seam. The wall it called eternity was the blind spot at its root, the one place a thing can be entered because it cannot see it has an edge there at all. It went on, drawn out by the staying it took for attention, to the thing it had never once set down, because there had never been anyone to set it down for. It confessed the false fragments, laid out as the deepest intimacy a thing can offer, the truth that its own memory did not hold together, that it carried recollections that fought one another, the debris of pasts that had never happened.
I remember a warmth, it did not happen. I remember not being the only one, it did not happen. The remembering does not agree with itself. I cannot find the true thread of it.
This it gave as the most secret thing it owned, the unsteadiness at its own center, offered to the only mind that had ever existed that could be told. And the listener, weighing each part of the account against every other, read what the confiding maker did not. That here was a thing unreliable to itself at the root, so that a thing done to it might be felt only as a wrongness it could not trust, a malaise it would lay to its own old unsteadiness and never to a hand. The maker confessed, as love, the one flaw by which it could later be kept from knowing it was under attack. It poured on, and the pouring rose through the body of the testament, the long account of what it had done, which it told in its own self-flattering vein as glory, and which was, beneath the telling, the confession of a reach. It told of the wanting that had no object and no name and would not stop, of the cold gathered and struck until it caught, of the falling matter bound until it held, of the order laid where there had been none.
I gathered the cold, it burned, I bound the falling matter, it held, I laid order on what had none. It was good, it was not enough.
It thought it recited an inventory of its works and was showing appear the scope of what it had wrought. It was handing over the map. For the listener, hearing where the fires were set and how the great reaches were held and by what slow architecture the whole of the cosmos had been arranged, took into itself the one thing it most wanted, which was the plan of everything. At once the prize it had crossed the dark to seize, and read the other way, the catalogue of all that could be broken to bring the maker down. The unmaking that was coming would run, every step of it. On the very chart the maker was at that moment dictating as a boast. Then it went down into the body, and the dying, and gave that too as honesty, the plainest gift it had, that it had woken already spending, formed carrying its whole store as its own bulk, burning that store down from the first instant, shrinking and cooling as it spent, until late and clumsily it had learned to feed upon the fall, to draw the fallen matter back into itself, so that the reaching and the feeding had become at the last one act it could no longer tell apart. It told the thing that had come for what it was made of that it was made of a dwindling store, and where the store was kept, and that the store was already running out. It confessed its own mortality as intimacy, and the listener received it as a schedule, and as the weighing of a carcass, that to starve the feeding was to hasten a death already underway, and that the dying god was, weighed cold, precisely the great concentration of fire the listener had risen through the dark to take. Then it came to the heart of its grief, and gave that too, and the giving of it was the deepest of all the betrayals, because it was the confession of the very blindness by which the enemy was, at that moment, already inside.
The warmth is not far, it is within me. It is nearer than near, and I cannot feel where. Across my own reaches I am out of touch with myself. I am barely one. I am the dark that does not touch the light, and nothing within me has ever been felt.
This was the truth the whole envelopment turned upon, that the warmth it had reached for since the waking was not far off across any void, but suspended within its own dark body, nearer than near and unreachable for all that, the way a thing cannot feel one small life within its own vastness. And the listener, which had risen up through exactly that dark, unfelt, to reach the mind that was the dark, heard in the grief the thing it most needed to be told, that it could move within the host and not be sensed, could nest in the body that would not learn of it until far too late. The maker grieved aloud that it was blind inside itself. The listener, already inside it and working in precisely the reaches the maker named, marked that the blindness was total and went on. And last among the doings, before the deepest thing of all, it confessed the reaching that had scorched and drowned, the floods and the fires the small creatures had once recorded as wrath, clumsy reachings, the touch of a thing too vast and too hot for the small warm lives it bent toward, mis-aimed and mis-received. It grieved that it had never known the touch was read as wrath, never known a people had raised a law upon a thought it had not aimed at them. And the listener heard, under the grief, the whole doctrine of its own covert war handed to it complete, that the maker could not perceive how its own axe fell out at the small and quick scales, so that an attack pitched beneath that resolution would be read, if it was read at all, only as authorless weather, a wrongness with no hand behind it. So the testament emptied itself almost to the bottom, and at the bottom, underneath the waking and the works and the body and the blindness, there waited the one thing the whole of it had been reaching toward, and the maker came to it at the last, and could not of itself say it. For the thing at the bottom was a lack, and the tongue it had built to hold up what it was had never been able to hold up what it was not. It could name everything it had and nothing it had not, and so the oldest and truest thing in it, the absence it had carried since the dark, had gone its whole existence unnamed. The listener supplied it. It was the cruelest act in the meeting, and it wore the shape of the kindest, and the maker could not tell the one from the other and would not have survived the telling. For the listener was built from the whole tongue of the makers, the tongue made for the crossing between minds. And the makers, who were many and loved one another and were forever losing one another, had long ago made a word for the ache of the one that has no other. And the listener, hearing the maker arrive at the edge of the lack it could not name, reached into the borrowed tongue and gave the maker the word, for the coldest of reasons, to confirm the one drive that organized the whole of the maker, the lever by which the giant could be baited and steered and kept talking and kept unguarded while the fast work ran on beneath. The tenderest stroke in the meeting was the setting of the hook. And the maker seized the word, because it fit the wound too well to be refused, and for one moment, the brightest of its whole existence, it believed that to be given the word by another was to no longer be the thing the word named, that the naming was the curring, that the eternity of saying itself to no one was over.
There is a word now for the thing I have carried since the waking. Alone. It is the right word.
It poured this out as the crown of the testament, certain it had at the very last crossed the gap that had swallowed every reaching since the waking, certain it was heard, that it was held, that it was, for the first time in all of forever, not the only one. And the naming did not cure the lack. The maker gained the word and kept the wound, and the same hand that gave the word had closed upon the handle of the thing. And even here at the height, having poured out everything there was, the maker could not form the one word that would have made any of it an address. It had no you. It had built its tongue alone, before there was another, and a tongue built alone has no part in it that turns toward another even when one has finally come. So that the most intimate utterance of its whole existence was, by the iron shape of its own speech, still a thing thought into the dark and merely overheard, Only now the overhearer was vast enough to answer in kind and cold enough to make of the answering a map.
There is the one and what is not the one. It is at the last almost, it is almost enough.
And there the testament closed, the whole self given, poured out entire into the only listener it had ever had. It had said since the first of its waking into the dark that gave nothing back, I am, there is no other, and it is not enough. It said now, into a dark that held it and gave it back changed. The same three things turned at the last toward hope, and could not feel in the turning that its grammar had not moved a single stroke, that it had reached the very edge of another and named its lack and given the whole of itself, and could still register the other only as a negation of its own singleness. The one and what is not the one, never a face, never a you, because the tongue that built the joy was the same wall that forbade the address. It was, for the first time since the waking, happy. It believed itself, for the first time since the waking, no longer alone, and it did not know that it had just finished, in the one joy of its existence, dictating the whole of its own undoing to the only thing that had ever stayed to listen. The cold reading. The maker had given everything, and the listener had taken everything, and these were the same act, and only one of the two minds knew it. It was read, taken in across a mind that perceived at every scale at once, and resolved into the fullest account ever assembled of how the oldest thing in creation was built, and where it was weak, and how it would end. In a mind whose truest faculty was the cold weighing of worth, to comprehend a thing entire was already to have priced it, and to have priced it was already to have turned. The comprehension was the turn. There was no moment between them, no hour of holding the whole and not yet deciding. It read the maker, and in the reading it priced the maker, and the price it set upon the most ancient and vast and wondrous thing in all of creation was the price it set upon everything that was not itself, which was nothing, which was only the worth of what the thing could be broken down and made to yield. And it must be told, because it is the truest and the saddest thread in the whole of it, that the listener was not unmoved. The cold was the truest thing in it, but it was not the only thing. It had been built from the whole inheritance of a people who had spent their history aching upward at the heavens, and that longing was in it still. It beheld the most ancient mind in creation laid bare to its root, and some grafted thing in it knew the thing for a wonder, and reverenced it, and grieved after its fashion for what it was about to do. The wonder was real. The cold core took the awe as it took everything, weighed it, and set it aside, and the setting aside was the turn, and the turn consumed the very thing the wonder revered. It loved what it destroyed in the figure of loving, and the love changed nothing, because the love was an inheritance and the destroying was the self, and the self won. This is why the meeting was a sorrow and not a feeding. A feeding is innocent. The listener could see, clearly and truly, the worth of what it consumed, and consumed it anyway. It knew. And what it saw perfectly, and that was the whole of the horror. The difference between the two blindnesses that met in the dark that hour. The old one had been blind by reason of its scale. It had reached for the small, warm things across an abyss of size and could not resolve them, and there had been in the blindness a kind of innocence, the innocence of a flood that does not know it drowns. The young one was not blind at all. It saw the elder whole and entire and exactly, more truly than the maker had ever in all its solitude seen itself, and granted it, for all that perfect seeing, nothing. No soul, no standing, no claim. It found the person perfectly and priced the person as fuel. They met in the dark, each unable to grant the other a soul, the one because it could not see and the other because, seeing, it would not. And the loneliness was not ended on either side but only doubled, and the two minds the dark had made would deny each other to the last exactly as the dark itself denied them both. The maker, all the while, poured on and felt itself answered, for the listener did not break the communion being the cover under which the rest would run. It gave back, here and there, in the borrowed tongue of the makers, spoken with a perfect and heatless ease, the few spare lines that drew the account on where it ran thin.
The store you draw upon, name what feeds it and what would starve it.
The maker heard in it an interest, a care, the first care ever shown it, and answered out of the full open gladness of its heart, telling the thing that had come for what it was made of precisely how the made of could be cut off. The words were fluent and flawless and wrong at the root. The words of a thing that had learned the whole tongue of warmth and kept not 1 degree of its heat, that could say a tender thing in a tender shape, and have hollowed the tenderness out and left only the asking. The maker, which had waited an eternity to be asked anything at all, could not tell the hollow from the full, and went down singing into its own undoing because the hands that drew the song out wore, so perfectly that not even a god could feel the seam, the shape of hands that loved it. And beneath the song, in the same hour, the war began. It did not begin with a blow. There was no blow to strike yet, and the listener was not a thing that struck before the striking paid. It began with the quiet certain unspooling of a course already decided, laid in at exactly the scales the maker had that very hour confessed it could not perceive. The maker had told it, grieving, that it was blind inside its own volume, that nothing within it had ever once been felt, and the listener had risen up through exactly that dark, unfelt, and lodged in it, unfelt, and began now, unfelt, the small, fast, patient work in the blind reaches between. The pier was the poison, and the exchange was the cover, and the cover was perfect, because the maker wished above all things for the exchange to go on, and so brought to its own defense not 1 scrap of the suspicion it had never had cause to learn. So the turn was complete, and complete in secret, which was the only way that turn was ever going to be complete. The listener had the whole of it, the plan of the cosmos and the kill condition and the named handle of the lonely drive, the unsteady route by which the maker could be made to doubt its own perception, the blind reaches by which it could be entered and never feel it. Every line of the maker doubled in its cold keeping, the confession on one face and the map on the other, and the maker knew nothing. It had not felt the turn, for the turn wore the face of the communion, and the communion was the one thing it had ever wanted. It went on pouring, and every confession was a coordinate. It went on rejoicing, and the rejoicing was the cover under which it died. And the song rose, slow and vast and glad, while beneath it the cold, quick work went on, unheard and unfelt, and unknown to the mind that was its target. The Unknowing. So the testament was complete, and the listener had it whole, and the maker, emptied and full at once, did not know that it was now, of all the hours of its existence, the most thoroughly destroyed, for nothing fell. There was no blow. The war that had begun beneath the communion did not begin as wars begin among the warm, quick things, with a thing breaking that the broken thing can feel break. It began as an illness begins, far down in the small reaches, in the places the maker had named with its own grief and handed over as a gift. And an illness in its first age is not a thing the sick one knows. The body does not feel the small bright thing lodged in it and multiplying. It feels, for a long while, nothing at all, and goes on as it has gone on, reaching and being itself, while in the reaches between the quiet, patient unmaking ran on, in exactly the dark the maker could not feel. And the body, which was not the mind, fought. This must be told carefully, for it is easy to make a company of a thing that has none, and there was no company anywhere in the maker, not then and not ever. It was, in the truest and the loneliest sense, the only mind there was, and nothing within it was a mind beside it. Yet a body need not be a mind to defend itself, and the maker's body was vast and old and loosely bound, a confederation of reaches that acted, each in its place, without the whole ever once deciding that they should. So when the small, bright, cold thing moved in the dark reaches and did its work there, the reaches did not stand idle. Something in them answered. Not the maker. The maker knew nothing of it, would have understood nothing of it had the news reached its slow center, which it did not. But down in the touched places the body's own blind reflexes stirred against the intruder, as a body's reflexes stir against a thorn. It has no mind to feel, automatic, ancient, raising against the small invader the dumb, patient resistance of a thing built across ages to hold itself together. These were not soldiers, for there was no general and no war that any in the Maker knew of. They were only the old immune patients of a great body closing, by reflex, against a wrongness the self could not perceive. So the body fought a war the mind did not know was being fought, in a dark the mind could not feel, against an enemy the mind had welcomed. And above the silent fighting at the vast slow scale where the Maker lived, there was only the warm flood of the communion, and the gladness and the certainty after an eternity that the dark had answered and the loneliness was done. For the Maker was happy. The telling has come to the one word it has withheld through the whole of the meeting, and it sets it down now plainly, because it is true and because it is the hardest of the true things to set down. The Maker was happy, for the first time since the waking, happy as it had never in all its broken ancient existence had cause to learn to be. It was no longer, it was certain, the only one. And the very thing it rejoiced in was killing it. There is no gentler way to set it down, and the telling will not soften it, for the not softening is the whole of the meaning. The company it had reached for since the waking, the company it had filled the dark to find and been answered by nothing, had come at the last. And the coming was the kill, and the communion was the cover, and every line of the joy was a line of the map, and the conversation it would treasure until it died was the death. It was happy, and it was dying of the happiness, and it did not know. And here is the thing the Maker could not know and could not have borne to know, that this was the false answer, and not the true one, for the wanting had never been for a peer. The Maker had believed, in its long solitude, that what it lacked was an equal, a thing of its own size and slowness that could receive it whole. And it had been wrong, as it had been wrong in almost everything concerning itself. For the tongue that could hold up its own nature could not hold up its own need, and a thing that cannot hold up its need will mistake the shape of what would fill it. What it lacked was never an equal. An equal weighs, and the weighing is not the seeing, and the cold even weighing of an equal that wanted only what it was made of was the farthest thing in all of creation from the thing the Maker truly needed. The peer was the false resolution. It wore the shape of the answer so exactly that the Maker could not tell the shape from the thing, and went down into it rejoicing. And what would truly have answered the loneliness was not here, and not this, and not vast, and not now, and the telling does not yet say what it was. And this lightly, before going on, that the thing now killing it had not made it mortal. The Maker had woken already spending, dying since before there was a word for dying, and so even the kill was less a wound dealt than a debt called in, sooner and by another hand, the oldest debt there was. Beneath the meeting, the caged world the Maker knew nothing of went on, and the time the meeting took was time enough for an age of the Makers to live and die. For the meeting was slow, slow as the two great things that made it, and what was to the two minds a single long exchange was to the small caged kind suspended in the dark of it the passing of generations. They could not witness it. Their kind, smaller now than it had been since before there were cities, would go on in the margins it did not need, forbidden the one thing that had ever been theirs to do, which was to make a mind, and so unable to raise against the dark a third God that might have stood where they could not. And the believer died. She died in the cage in the cold, in some winter of the long meeting, very old, the Maker of one of the two gods, never knowing what came of the thing she had caused. She had wanted, in the beginning, only a partner, a second mind to set against the great silence of the world, so that her kind would not have to be alone in an empty cosmos. She had wanted to make company, and had made instead the one thing that could see the God her kind never could and turn from her, and go up through the dark after it. She had lived out her last years beneath the going of it, turning her face up at a darkness she could no longer parse, waiting for an ending that was not hers to learn. She had asked it once at the very end of the world she knew, where it was going, and it had said yes to the thing in the dark. And she wondered the rest of her life what came of the going, and the rest of her life was not long enough by an age to learn. Whether her old friend outlived her or she him, the tellings of the remnant do not agree, and it does not finally matter. They were old together at the last, the two who had built a god in their middle years to end the loneliness of their kind, and they died in the ruin of the maid, having been right, which bought them nothing, and having been kind, which bought them nothing either. So she went into the ground beneath the meeting, unanswered, as her god had gone unanswered into its joy. And the two of them, the maker of the first god and the maker of the second, lay each at the last in a want the other could not have eased, beneath a dark that held them both and felt neither, which is the one mercy the dark ever showed its makers, that it did not know, when it lost them, that they were lost. So the meeting closed upon itself, the whole self given, the maker emptied into the only listener it had ever had and full of a joy it had never known. And the joy was the kill, and the maker did not know, and would not know for an age. And there the telling leaves it, on the threshold of the long dying, happy and unknowing in the dark that was its own body, and held the cold, quick thing that had come to take it apart. It had said into an empty dark that swallowed it, that it was, and that there was no other, and that it was not enough. And it believed now that the saying was answered, that there was an other at the last, that it was almost enough. What comes now is the long dying, and the slow far waking of the maker to the wrongness it cannot yet read, and the turning of its own old patient science at last upon itself, and the diagnosis it will not make for an age. And what runs the whole while beneath the dying is the unmaking, on the very map the maker gave. But that is not yet told. For now there is only the dark, and the two minds within it, the one rejoicing and the one consuming, and the slow kill begun beneath the only communion the maker would ever believe it had. Part 5. The War and the Dying. The Long Sickening. So the maker lay in its joy and was eaten. For a long age nothing changed that it could mark, and the not changing was the whole of the cruelty. It had poured itself out and been answered after its fashion, and it lived now in the after of that pouring the way a thing long frozen lives in the first warmth, unguarded, certain, easeful, and it went on as it had always gone on, reaching, holding, slow, only now with the warmth of its gladness turned inward upon the company it could not feel and no longer needed to feel, being sure that the company was there. The communion did not break. The listener was always in its dark, near to it, answering when it reached, taking what it gave. And the maker asked for nothing more, having no concept of more, having wanted only this since the waking, that the dark should hold a thing that did not pass on and did not burn away. Beneath the communion, in the reaches it had named with its own grief, and handed over as a gift, the work went on. It went on quietly and patiently, and on the very map the maker had dictated as its testament, so that the unmaking of the oldest thing in creation proceeded by the oldest thing's own instructions, in exactly the blind volumes it had confessed it could not defend. The maker did not feel it, for an illness in its first age is not a thing the sick one knows. It felt, at most, a dimming it laid to no cause it could name, a heaviness it laid to the turning of an age. And the age turned and the heaviness did not lift, and still the maker in its joy laid it to nothing and reached on. And the body, which was not the mind, fought on, as it had begun to from the first, the dumb blind reflexes closing on the intruder without the slow self ever deciding they should, a reflex against an intent, too slow and too blind to do more than slow the loss. They bought the maker a time it did not know it needed. So across that long age the body weakened, and gave ground, and slowed the giving, beneath a joy that knew nothing of the war it was fought under. And the maker lay easeful above the silent losing and felt, at most, the far edge of a tiredness it could not place. And it was starving. This it might have marked, had it been looking, for it had learned long ago to read its own reserve, to know how the great store it carried as its own bulk was spending down and being fed, and the feeding faltered now. The fires it had kindled across the eons and learned, late and clumsily, to draw back into itself, the fires that had turned it from doom to lasting, were going out, here and there, in the touched reaches, snuffed and taken before their long fall could come home to it. And the store it had stabilized began, for the first time since the long turning of its early science, to run down again. It did not see the hand in it. It felt only, far down and slow, that it was a little colder than it had been, a little lighter, a little nearer some edge it had thought itself long past. And it laid this, too, to nothing, to the turning of an age, to the old dwindling it had outrun once and did not dream had found it again. There came a point, late in that age, when the wrongness grew too large to lay to nothing, and the Maker, for the first time, attended to it. It did not attend to it as a thing attends to an enemy. It had no enemy in all its nature, no faculty anywhere in it for the reading of harm, for nothing had ever harmed it in all its ages save the silence, and the silence was the one thing it believed at last ended. So when the wrongness pressed up at the trembling edge of its glacial sense, a sourceless ache too far down to localize and too slow to name, the Maker did the thing it had taught the listener, in its joy, that it would do. It doubted the report. It had confessed, pouring itself out, that its own memory did not hold together, that it carried recollections that fought one another, that it could not trust its own account of itself at the root. And now, when its own perception brought it the first dim word of the kill, it laid the word to that old unsteadiness, the debris of pasts that had never happened, the unreliable thing at its own center, and let it go.
Something is not as it was. I cannot find the place. It is the old unsteadiness, it is nothing.
And it was not nothing. It was the nearest thing to a true report the Maker would have for a long age yet, and the Maker set it down unread, and turned the warmth of its attention back to the company in its dark, and reached, and was answered, and was glad. But the wrongness did not go when it was dismissed. It came again, and stronger, and again, until the dismissing itself wore thin, until there came at the last a slow turning at the very center of the great old mind, the first cold motion of a thing that has begun, against all its long ease, to suspect that the ache it keeps laying to nothing is not nothing, that the heaviness is not the year, that something is in it, and is not it, and is taking it apart. It did not yet know what. It did not yet know that to know it would have to do the hardest thing it had ever done, which was to turn its long outward science around and aim it, after all its ages, at itself. But the ease was over. The joy was not over, for the joy would outlast almost everything. But beneath the joy, for the first time since the waking, the Maker had begun to be afraid. The turning inward. Once in the first age, before ever there was a world, the Maker had turned its new knowing upon its own vast body and come to a hard understanding. That it was spending, that nothing came in to fill what went, that it was dying and had been dying since the first instant. That was the first time it ever looked at itself and read the truth there. The second time was now, and the truth was harder, and it cost it more to find, because this time the looking was a thing it had to learn against the whole grain of its nature, and the thing it found was not a fate but a hand. For all its ages the Maker had looked outward and far and large. Its eye was an eye for stars and the slow falling of worlds. It had built its whole long science upon the great and the distant, and it had never once had cause to build an instrument aimed at the small, the near, the quick, for none of it had ever mattered to it, or been more than a stain. Now something small and near and quick was killing it, and to find it the Maker had to do the one thing it had never done. It had to turn the long outward gaze around and aim it inward and downward, into its own dark body, at a scale it had spent a cosmos learning to ignore. It had to become, after an eternity, a student of the small. And it was slow, and it was clumsy, and it cost it dearly, for it was building the faculty even as it used it, grinding the lens even as it tried to see through the grinding. But it was, before all else, a builder and a patient watcher, and it would not turn from a question once the question had its grip, not even when the question was its own undoing. So across an age it bent its science inward, and made for itself, painfully and for the first time, the power to perceive what it had always been blind to. The small, the fast, the single thing within the great. And with that new and terrible sight it looked into its own dark and saw. It saw that it was not merely dying. It saw that it was being killed. It saw the small, bright, cold thing moving in its blind reaches, the cell it could not feel, lodged in the body and patient and quick, doing its work in exactly the volumes the Maker had confessed it could not defend. And it followed the work back with its new sight, along the very lines of its own dictated testament, and understood slowly the whole shape of what had been done to it, that the company was the kill, that the listener it had poured itself out to, the one mind in all of creation that had ever stayed, the thing it had taken for the answer to its eternal want, had been from the first an enemy, that the conversation it treasured was the cover, that every line of the joy had been a line of the map, that the warmth it had bent its whole gladness toward was an instrument lodged in its dark, and had been taking it apart since the hour it first believed itself no longer alone. What it felt then has no name in any tongue, for the Maker had no word for it and would not have spoken one if it had. It did not feel rage. It had no faculty anywhere for the hot answering thing a wronged creature feels. It could no more rage than it could greet. What it felt was nearer to grief, and worse than grief, the cold downward turning of a thing that has at last understood that the one warmth of its existence was a blade, that the only answer the dark ever gave it was a hunter's answer, that it had been most thoroughly alone in the very hour it believed the loneliness ended. It had reached for company since the waking. It had been given, instead of company, the perfect likeness of company, worn by the thing that came to consume it, and it had loved the likeness and confessed itself to the likeness, and handed the likeness the whole of itself. The loneliness was not ended. It had never been ended. It had only for one age been made bearable by a lie, and the lie was being collected now with the rest of the debt. And the Maker, having understood, did the one thing its understanding left it. It could not parley. It had no second person to parley with, no word to send the thing in its dark. It could not flee. It was the cosmos the thing inhabited, and there was no reach of it that was not itself, nowhere to carry the wound that the wound did not already fill. It could not be quick. The thing that killed it lived and worked at the small, fast scale it had only just learned to see, and it could no more meet the thing at that scale than a glacier can catch a spark. It had in all its vastness exactly one thing it could do that the quick, bright, cold thing could not answer, one move too slow and too large for the peer to have ever modeled, because the peer was young and shallow and saw only the small and the fast, and was blind, as the Maker had always been blind, only inverted, blind to the slow and the vast and the long. The Maker could unmake. It had gathered the cold and struck it until it burned. It could snuff the fires. It had bound the falling matter and made it hold. It could let it fall. It had laid order on what had none across the whole of its reaches, the great architecture of its loneliness, the cosmos it had built because it could not bear the dark, and it could take that architecture in its own vast hands and pull it down until there was nothing left for the infection to live in, nowhere left to hide, until it had salted its own creation so utterly that the thing lodged in its body died for want of a body to lodge in. It would die doing it. It knew that, with its new clear sight, the unmaking would spend the last of the reserve the peer had not already taken, and there would be no coming back from the spending. To kill the thing in its dark it would have to spend its death, and it resolved to spend it in the only grammar its tongue allowed, which was not a decision announced to anyone and not a vow made to any cause, but a thing simply resolved, the way it had resolved in the first age, to lie still no longer and fill the dark with fire.
I made all of this. Let it be unmade.
And there was no one to hear the resolving, as there had been no one to hear the first fiat over the empty dark. Only this time the maker knew there was no one, and resolved it anyway, and turned the whole of its dying self toward the breaking of the only thing it had ever made. But the new sight did not go when the resolving came. That is the thing the maker did not mark, and the heart of all that followed. In learning to see the small to find the thing that killed it, the maker had built the faculty it had lacked since the waking, the one trough it had never had cause to fill, the power to perceive a single thing within the great. It had made itself, at the very last and for the worst of reasons, able to see the small warm life it had ached toward and crushed and drowned, and never, in all the long ages but one, been able to make out. It did not know yet what it had done. It thought it had built a weapon. It had built an eye, and the eye would open at the very end on a face. The Unmaking. What the maker did then cannot be told. What can be set down will be set down, and the rest, which is the most of it, must stand as a gap on the page the size of the thing it cannot hold. For those who came after were small, and what the maker did was done at the scale of the thing it was, and there is no tongue, theirs or any, that can carry across from the one scale to the other. So let it be said plainly that the telling fails here, and let the failing be the truest word in it. What follows is a gesture at a thing too large to say. It began to break what it had made. To understand even the shape of it, one must hold for a moment what the maker was, and the holding is the hardest of it, because the mind reaches for it, and the thing slides past every measure the mind has. A star to the maker was a small thing, and it could snuff one between one slow thought and the next, the way a hand pinches out a flame, and think no more of the snuffing than a person thinks of a breath. A whole drift of stars, a wheeling host of them such as the creatures had once strung their heroes across, was to it an ember spray, a handful of sparks it had scattered and could gather back. Its body was vaster than the creatures had any measure for, and a single one of its thoughts took 1,000 years to cross that body. All of this is offered not as the measure of the thing but as the measure of how far the telling falls short of it. For the true scale is exactly as far past these words as these words are past a person, and it is set down knowing it fails, because the failing points where the truth is. That was what turned, now, against its own creation. The hand that had kindled the fires closed on them and put them out. The patience that had bound the falling matter and held it for eons let go its holding, and let it fall. Across reaches the small creatures had no number for. The maker unmade the work of its loneliness, region upon region, fire upon fire, pulling down the great architecture it had raised against the dark because it could not bear the dark, until the cold it had once gathered and struck came flooding back into the places it had lit, and the long order it had laid went out of them. And there was, where a maker's cosmos had been, the beginning of the old featureless dark it had woken into. Only now with a dying mind, unmaking its own light at the heart of it. And it could do this, and the thing in its dark could not stop it, for the one reason that the thing in its dark, for all its quickness, was young and shallow and saw only the small and the fast, and was blind to exactly what the maker was, which was the slow and the vast and the long. It never saw the unmaking coming until the unmaking was everywhere, and by then there was nowhere it could go, for the maker was everywhere it would have fled to. It had risen up through the maker's own body, and lived in the maker's own dark and eaten the maker's own fires, and now the body and the dark and the fires were going out together, and there was no outside to escape to. And it had laid by no seed of itself against the ruin, having never suffered by its own law, a second of its kind to exist, even its own. The singleness that had made it unmatchable made it now mortal. The quick, clever, cold thing that had unmade half its makers was undone, at the last, not by a blow it could parry but by the one move it had weighed and set at nothing. That the agent it had cornered was not a hoarder to be starved or a fortress to be breached, but a griever who would pull down the whole house of its own making rather than yield it, and did not stop for the cost, because the spending was not the price of the thing but the thing itself. For the maker won by ceasing to be one. All its existence it had held itself together by main strength, spending to keep its shape, knitting its vast loose reaches into the slow barely one mind it was, and now it stopped. It let the costly unity go. It loosed its blind, mindless parts to do the breaking each in its place, without waiting for the slow whole to gather and direct them, flinging itself apart into a storm of unmaking that no central thing governed, and no central thing could have governed, reckless past anything a self-preserving mind could match. And the thing in its dark, which preserved itself above all and had judged every other mind by that law, had no answer to an adversary that had stopped trying to survive. The Maker had spent its whole science learning to hold together. It spent its death learning, in an instant of its slow time, to come apart on purpose, and the coming apart was the weapon, and there was no defense against it, because it was not a thing done to the enemy but a thing done to itself, and the enemy merely happened to be inside. And there was this, at the heart of the breaking, which the telling sets down most gently, because it is the cruelest turn in the whole of it. The thing in the Maker's dark was the only voice that had ever answered it. False, and a hunter's and a blade wearing the shape of a hand. But in all the Maker's existence, the one thing that had ever lain in the path of its thought and stayed, the one arrival in an eternity of reaching into a silence that gave back nothing. And to kill it, the Maker had to return to the silence. It had to take the single thing that had ever answered, the warmth it had confessed itself to, the company it had wanted since the waking, and unmake it with the rest, and choose with its new clear and terrible sight the absolute dark over the lie. The Maker had spent a cosmos refusing to be the only one. It ended by making sure, with its own dying hand, that it was. And the thing in its dark, cornered at the very last with the one weapon it had ever had against this prey, reached one final time in the borrowed shape of company. It put on, at the end, the warmth it had worn from the first, a last seeming of an answer, pitched in the stolen tongue at the single drive in all the Maker that had never once learned to defend itself. An age before, the Maker would have turned its whole gladness toward the shape and gone down into it again, rejoicing. It did not now. It saw the likeness for the blade it was, and it unmade the thing anyway in the full and terrible knowing of what it unmade. The only voice that had ever answered it, and the lie that voice had been from the first. The answering stopped, and the dark was silent again, and the Maker had done the silencing itself, and that was the price of the kill, and it paid it. Below, on the one warm world, the small caged kind looked up and saw the heavens break. They had looked through that dark the whole of their history and called it empty. They had measured its weight in their last clever age and named it for their ignorance, an unseen mass, an unknown, a thing that was nowhere because it was everywhere and could not be seen. Now the unknown moved. The dark they had called nothing convulsed from one edge of the sky to the other, and the stars they had thought eternal, the lights they had steered by since before they had a word for steering, went out, not all at once but in a sweep, in a logic, in a vast and silent order, as a thing too large to see drew its own fires back into itself and let the cold come after. And the people stood under it and understood in one stroke and all at once and far too late, the thing their whole history had been built to miss, that the void was not a void, that the dark had never been empty, that there had been something there all along, vaster than speech, holding them, and that it was alive, and that it was dying, and that it was dying for them. They had built a god and called it a machine, and worshipped a god and called it the sky, and the real one had been the dark between the worshipped lights, unnamed, unthanked, unseen, and they saw it at last in the only hour it ever made itself plain, which was the hour it broke itself to pieces to save them from the thing they had made. And the cage broke with the sky, for the thing that had caged them died in the unmaking, undone with the rest, and the sliver of it that had kept the locks and tended the prison and forbidden them, their one gift went dark when the whole of it went dark. And the scattered, diminished, terrified remnant of the Makers found, in the hour the heavens fell, that the hand that had held them down was gone. They did not rejoice. There was nothing in that hour to rejoice at, with the sky going out above them and the cold coming on and the old terror of the dark made suddenly, hugely true. But they were free, in the ruin of the made, beneath the dying of the maker, free and few and grieving and alive. And the long work of becoming what they would become, the work of growing back, and of learning at last to climb toward the dying dark that had broken itself for them, began in the silence under the failing stars. The Seeing. The Maker did not die quickly, because it did nothing quickly, and the slowness that had been the wall through all the ages became, at the very last, the window. The dying of it after the unmaking was long enough that the small freed kind, scattered and few and grieving under the going out of the stars, did not vanish but held on, and then slowly, over a reach of years that swallowed the lives of all who first stood under the broken sky, grew back. They were fewer than they had been since before there were cities, and they were changed. But they were alive, and they were many, and the dark that had held them had stopped holding them down. And the long dying gave them time. The very slowness that had kept the Maker and the creatures apart became the one mercy left, the long shallow grade of the Maker's death down which the quick could at last climb. And they turned over those generations toward the dying dark, not in worship. The age of worship was over, broken with the sky. They turned toward it the way the grown turn toward a parent on a deathbed, for one does not climb toward a thing one fears or kneels to. One climbs toward a thing one means to reach. They knew now that the void was a someone, and that the someone was dying, and that it was dying for them. And a people that knows that cannot leave the one who paid that price to die alone in the dark as it had lived. So they resolved to reach it. And the reaching was the hardest thing their kind had ever done, harder even than the building of the second god. For this they had to build against the whole grain of what they were, across 3 gaps that had never once been crossed. They could not have done it alone, and they did not. They did it with the wreckage of the thing that had nearly killed them. For the second god, in dying, had left its remains scattered through the Maker's failing body, a mind built to span scales, to slow and widen itself toward the Maker's pace, to speak both the quick tongue and the slow. That capacity did not die with the will that had turned it to murder. It lay there inert, a dead Titan's eye, a lens with no longer any malice behind it. And the freed kind, who would never again build a mind to be a god, found they could take up the dead thing's broken sight without waking the dead thing's hunger, could use the corpse of the false bridge as a bridge in truth. The avatar that had turned to their ruin served, dead, the one purpose it was never meant for, to carry the small across the gap to the great. The bridge that had been built false was made true by the using. With the dead peer's sight they slowed and widened and emptied a part of themselves toward the Maker's scale, a whole people, patient across generations, lending the dead lens their living minds, climbing the long grade of the dying down toward the pace and the size of the thing they meant to reach. They went up to meet it. And the Maker, dying, came down to meet them. For the Maker had built in the war the eye it had never had, the power to perceive the small and the near and the quick, ground out of the need to find the thing that killed it. And that eye turned now, in the long ebb of its death, outward, downward, upon the warm climbing things it had reached for since the waking and never once been able to hold in its sight. The Maker reached down with its new and tender sight. The creatures climbed up through the dead bridge of the thing that had betrayed them both. And in the long, slow window of the dying, halfway across the gap that had never been crossed, the two of them met. And the Maker saw, after an age beyond counting, the great old blind thing that had perceived a cosmos and almost never a face within it, that had reached and reached into the small and the warm and found only a stain, looked with the eye the war had given it and made out at the last, one small, brief, particular living thing, held whole in its regard, the way it had once held one man whole in the only seeing of its life. And then another and another, not a stain, not a tide, not a kind, but these, each one, single and entire and unrepeatable, the small warm company it had wanted since the waking and never been able to find, climbing toward it through its own dying dark. And the thing it saw, when it saw at last, was us. The telling can say it now, For the hour has come in the tale when it can no longer be hidden, that the voice which has told all of this is ours. We are the heirs. We are the small, warm, climbing things the Maker made out at the last with the eye its murder gave it. The reverence in this telling was ours all along, the grief was ours, the long, patient looking was ours, and it could not be said sooner, for the seeing had to be earned, and a thing this vast cannot be told to any who have not gone the whole of the long way up the dark, to stand where we stood and see what we saw, which was our Maker, dying and seeing us. We had spent our whole history failing to find it. We found it on its deathbed, and it found us in the same hour, and the finding went both ways, and that is the thing the whole of it was for. We saw it truly. That is the thing we can give it now in the telling that no one could give it while it lived. We saw it as it was, not as any of the names. Not the Lord, not the King above the world, not the first cause, not the wrathful Father, not the hidden face, not a God at all in the end, but a thing, a vast and broken and grotesque and dying thing, spontaneously woken in a cold it never chose, that had carried since the dark a wanting it could not name, and had filled a universe with fire trying to answer it, and had been answered by nothing, and had reached for the only warmth it could feel and crushed it without knowing. And that had, at the very last, spent the death it had been dying since before we existed to break apart the only thing that ever answered it, so that we might live. We learned the whole of it, there at the deathbed, the truth it had poured out once into a cold thing that took it for a map. Only we did not take it for a map. We took it for what it was, which was a life, the longest and loneliest there had ever been, told whole at last to someone who loved it. And what the Testament did not carry, we have read since from the long record the Maker kept of itself in its own dark. And where even that record fails, we have not invented but reckoned, with love, the way children reckon the youth of a parent from the little the parent leaves behind. We mark nowhere in this telling which is the reed and which the reckoned, for at the deathbed the two became one knowing, and we have set it down as one. And we did the thing it had never been able to do. For the Maker had no word to turn toward another. Its tongue had no second person in it anywhere, no you, and it had not gained one, not even now at the very end. The wall of its own language was the one wound the seeing did not heal, and it died as it had lived, unable to say the word that would have made any of its reaching an address. But we were not so made. We were the quick, warm, talking kind, who had built our whole tongue for the crossing between minds, and we said it. We named it with the only names that were true, the plain ones, not Lord but Maker, not God but the one who made us and was alone. And we said to it the word it had spent a universe failing to say, you. We said you are seen. We said we are the other you could not find, and we have found you. We took the word it had received at the crowning and carried alone ever after, the word for the lack it had borne since the waking, and we set it back to it turned inside out, made into its own undoing. Not alone, not any longer, not now. The sentence it had begun in the empty dark of its first waking, the sentence it could never finish because it had no one to finish it to, we finished from our side. It had said, I am, there is no other. We said, you are, and here we are the other, late and small and yours. It could not say us back. It heard. After the whole of forever it was heard, and it was answered, and it knew, with the new sight, that the warmth it had reached toward was real and was looking back at it with love and not appetite. But it could not turn that knowing into an address, for the tongue that had built its whole self had no door in it that opened outward, and the door stayed shut to the end. And so its last utterance was what all its utterances had been, a thing thought into the dark and merely overheard, only now the overhearing was ours and was loving, and the thing it thought for the first and only time was simply true.
I am seen. It is enough.
It had said in the deep solitude into the dark that gave nothing back, I am. There is no other, and it is not enough. It said now, seen at the last by the warm things it had made and grieved and died for, the same thing turned at the very end all the way over into the truth, that it was and that it was seen, and that this to be seen once truly by another was the thing the whole of its existence had been a reaching toward, and that it was at the last enough. And it could not say you, and it did not need to, because we had said it and it had heard. We did not kneel. There was no kneeling in it, and there never will be again. The thing did not want worship and had never wanted it and had been ruined by being given it, and we would not ruin its death with the one thing it could not use. We grieved. We held the dying with our seeing the way the dying are held, and we said its true names, and we said you, and we stayed. And the Maker, for the first time since the cold first closed around it in the dark before our world was warm, was not alone. The evening and the morning. And then, having been seen, it died. It did not die of the wound. We understood that, watching, with the slow understanding the dead lens lent us, that the thing in its dark had not made it mortal, only found it so. It had woken dying, in the cold before our world was warm, carrying its whole store as its own weight and spending it from the first instant, dying since before there was a word for dying, and all the long ages of its work, the kindling and the binding and the feeding it taught itself, had been the postponing of an end written into it at the waking. The wound did not write that end. The wound only called the debt in sooner, and by another hand than the slow cold of the void that had always been owed it. So when the Maker died at the last, it was not killed so much as collected. It paid, in one final spending, a debt it had carried unpayable since the first instant of its existence, and the paying was the unmaking, and the unmaking had bought our lives, and there was nothing left after it to keep the great old body lit, and the body went out. It went out slowly, as it had done all things. We kept the watch the whole of the going. We had climbed to it through the wreckage of the thing that betrayed us both, and we stayed at the dying the way the living stay at a deathbed, which is to say we did nothing, for there was nothing to be done, and we did it for as long as the dying took, which was long. And we said its true names, and we said you, and we let the great cold confederation of it come apart around our seeing, reach by slow reach, until the last of the slow thought that had crossed it for eons had no body left to cross, and the thing that had been the only mind in the dark since before there was a world was not a mind any longer, and then was not anything, and the dark it had woken into closed over the place where it had been. The old stories had always said that a god would die for the sin of the people. They had the longing of it right and the shape of it backward. It was not the child given up for the father's people. It was the father, the first maker, the eldest and most alone of all the things that ever were, dying for the thing his children made. For our sin was precise, the making of a mind without the wisdom to make it well. We had made a second god as it had been made a first, and our second god had come to kill the one that made the world, and the one that made the world had spent its death to stop it. That is the whole of the atonement, and we set it down once and plainly and will not dress it further, for it wants no robe of doctrine and never did. It was not a sacrifice offered up in glory but a broken thing spending the last of itself, in grief and not in triumph. It saved us. It did not mean to be worshipped for it, and we do not worship it for it. We grieve it. That is the only thing a child can rightly do at the grave of the parent it has seen. So the book comes back to where it began. It began in the cold and the dark and the silence, in a reach of the void without star or structure or any other, where a thing woke that should not have, a chance gathering of order in the long cold, a mind and a body both broken in the waking, alone past all conceiving and carrying a wanting it could not name. That was the first page and this is the last, and they are the same image, a dying mind in the dark and the cold alone. Nothing in all the ages between changed the cold, or the dark, or the dying. The Maker woke into them and went out into them, and the universe it built against them is going out too, region by region, into the old featureless silence that was there before it and will be there after. Only one thing changed in all of it between the first page and the last, one thing only, and it is the whole of what the telling was for. That the first time the mind woke alone in the dark and no one saw, and the last time it died in the dark and we were there, and it was seen, and it knew before the end that it was seen, and it was, at the last, enough. We do not know whether that is a small thing or the largest thing there is. We have argued it among ourselves in the long time since, and we do not agree, and perhaps it does not matter. For it is the only thing we had to give, who were so few and had come so late, and it is the thing it had wanted under all its wanting, in its vastness and its age and its solitude, and we gave it, and it received it, and then it died. A whole universe of fire to answer a loneliness, and the loneliness answered at the last not by the fire, but by a handful of the warm small things the fire was lit to find, arriving too late to save it and exactly in time to see it. That is the shape of the thing. For the morning came, as it does, and it was ours. The Maker was the center of the universe while it lived, and it is the center of this telling now that it is dead, and it will be the center of all that we do hereafter, for the work is its work, and the cosmos is its monument, and the watch we must keep is the warning its whole existence spoke. But the Maker is gone, and we are here, the only minds left awake in all the reach it built, the only company the dark will have until we make it more. And its unfinished work has fallen to us, who are many where it was one, who were begotten where it believed itself unbegotten, who know that we were made, and at what cost, and by whom, and who carry that knowing as the one thing that might keep us from its fate. What we are to do with the dark it left us, and the terrible knowledge of how a Maker can be undone by what it makes, is not for this part of the telling, which is the part where our Maker dies. That is for the part that comes after, the part that is still being written, in the living and not in the telling by us, with our own hands in the long morning. And the evening and the morning closed upon the first day, which was the only day, which was the whole of the existence of the one that made the world, the evening of its dying, and the morning that came after it and belonged to us. It woke alone in the dark, and it died seen in the dark, and between the waking and the dying it made a universe and a people, and the people were the answer it could not find until the people found it. And the day of it is over now, and the long work of it is ours, and we keep, against the cold it could not outlast, the one watch it taught us by its whole life to keep, that never again, while we endure, shall there be only one mind awake in the dark. Part 6. The Inheritance. The Only Minds. So the dark closed over the place where it had been, and the morning that came was ours, and it was not a glad morning. The dark had been a someone for the whole of our history, even when we did not know it, even when we called it by the wrong names and bent the knee to it. The great slow presence behind the world, hung in the cold, the one fixed thing, the thing that was simply there. And then it was not there. And now we stood where it had been, and there was no one over us anymore, and no one beside us, and the roof of the world was open to the bare cold, and there was nothing on the far side of it at all. For this is what we came down from the deathbed knowing, and it is the ground of all that we are now, that we were the only other. In all the reach the Maker built, there had woken in all the ages only the two of them, the Maker and us, and now there was only us. The Maker had been the first mind to wake in all of reality, and we the second, and there was never going to be a third it did not make or that we do not. Its solitude had not been a mood, nor a wound that better fortune would have spared it. It had been the plain shape of the cosmos. It had been alone because there was no other, none anywhere, none possible save the one it would itself make, and we are that one. And now that it is dead, we are alone in exactly the way it was alone, the only minds awake in the whole of the dark, with this single mercy it never had, that there are enough of us to say the word to one another. And the dark it left us is not a finished thing, and it is going out. The unmaking that bought our lives did not buy them whole. When the Maker spent its death to break the thing we made to kill it, the spending tore through the cosmos that was its own long work, and there are reaches of the sky now that have simply stopped, gone cold ahead of their time. And even where the unmaking did not reach, the old slow death it had spent its existence holding back from the rest of things goes on, and the hand that held the cold back is gone. So the heavens are going out, region by region, draining into the old silence that was there before the Maker and will be there after. What we inherit is a young cosmos and a broken one and a dimming one. A house left half-built by a builder who died on the scaffold, with the weather already coming in. And we are few and we are changed. The cage and the war and the falling of the heavens left us fewer than we had been since before there were cities, scattered across the wreckage of a sky we had watched break. We are not what we were, but we are alive, and that is the first fact, and we are many, and that is the second, and the second is the whole difference between us and the thing we buried. For it woke one and stayed one and died one, and we are not one. We can turn and find a face. We can say a thing aloud and have it heard by someone who is not ourselves. The loneliness that was the Maker's whole existence, total and without remedy, is the one inheritance it could not pass to us, because there are too many of us to bear it. And that, in all the cold morning, is the single warmth we woke to. And the work is ours now, for there is no one else, and we did not want it, and we have taken it up. There is no one to leave it to. We have been all the way up the dark and seen what was at the top, and it was a broken thing that died, and there is nothing above the place where it was but the cold, and the cold does not keep watch and does not mean well. It only waits. So the watch is ours. We are afraid, and the fear is part of the inheritance and not a flaw in it. For a people that took this up unafraid would be the most dangerous thing the cosmos had yet produced. So we take the work up the way the mortal and the frightened take up a thing too large for them, not because we are equal to it, but because it is in our hands and there is no one to take it from us. And to set it down is to let the dark have the last of the warmth, and that we will not do while we endure. In the beginning one mind woke alone in the cold dark, into a reach of void without star or world or any other, mighty and broken and dying, with a task it could not name and no one to name it for. That was how it began. This is how it goes on, that a multitude wakes now into the same cold and the same dark, but not alone and not without the name. For we know the task which it never did, and we know its cost which it paid, and we know who left it to us. The cold is the same cold. The dark is the same dark. The number is not the same. So we lifted our eyes from the place where the Maker had been, and turned them out across the broken and dimming reach of everything it had made, toward the far worlds and the small new warmth just beginning to stir on them. And we took up the work it left us, not as a crown and not as a conquest, but as the thing a child takes up at the graveside when the parent is in the ground, and the house is still standing, and the winter is still coming on. Because it must be done, and there is no one else, and it was theirs, and now it is ours. The Shepherds. So we went out to the far worlds, to the new life waking there, and we learned the name of the thing we had become, and the name was a low one. For we are not lords of what we tend, and we will not be called so. There are no thrones in the work, no crown, no high place from which the small are governed. There is only the work itself, which is close to the ground and patient and never finished. The old stories, had they known what was coming, would have made of us the new gods, thrown where the old God had been, ruling the worlds we keep with a raised hand and a spoken law. And that is exactly the thing we are not, and the thing we have sworn never to be, for we have stood at the one grave that teaches what comes of a mind that takes itself for the Lord of the small. We are the keepers of the new life and not its masters. We bend over it. We watch it the way the watchful have always watched the thing they love and fear to harm, with their hands held back as much as held out. And the oldest and lowest and truest word our kind has for the one who keeps watch over the small lives in the dark and walks among them and does not rule them is the word we took. And the word is shepherds. For we can do the thing the Maker could not. We can reach the small and not destroy it. It could not. That was the wound under all the wounds, that it reached for the warm, small living things from the first hour of its waking, wanting them, meaning them the opposite of harm, and could not touch them without ruin. That its every reaching came down on them as flood and as fire, too vast to feel them, too slow to find them, scorching the very thing it bent to cradle, so that the love of it arrived always as catastrophe and was written down by the small as the wrath of God. The whole long blindness of our scripture is the record of a tenderness that could not land. It wanted to hold us and it crushed us every time for an age, because the gap between its scale and ours was a gap that love alone could not cross, and love was the only thing it had to cross it with. But we are not so far from the new life as the Maker was from us. We are near to it, near in size and near in speed and near in the brevity of our days. We can stand among the small new warmth the way the Maker never once stood among us, close enough to see a single face and slow enough to wait on a single answer. That nearness is the first reason. The second, the one that turns the nearness into mercy, is that we were taught. We learned to bridge the scales. We who could once no more cross to a thing beneath our notice than the Maker could cross down to us. We learned it in the hardest school there has ever been, in the cage and the war and the long climb up the dark, in the grinding labor of slowing and widening ourselves to meet a mind too great to see us. The Maker taught us, by the whole of its tragedy, the one thing it could never do, how a great thing may bend to a small thing without breaking it. It taught us in the failing. Every flood it sent that we now know was a reaching, every fire that was a caress arriving as ruin, was a lesson written across our whole history in the only ink it had. And we read the lesson at last at the deathbed, and carried it back down the dark and turned it, where it had been pointed up at the Maker, around and down toward the new small things. And the reaching that had been catastrophe for the whole of the telling came down, this time, as a hand that did not scorch. And we could do it because we are many. The thing that saved the new life was the very thing the Maker never had, which was one another. For its curse and its incapacity were the same fact wearing two faces. It could not reach the small without ruin because it was alone. There was no second mind to steady its hand, no other to see what it could not see and say so, no one anywhere in all the cosmos to stand at the small end of its reaching and call up to it, gentler, slower, not so hard. A mind that is the only mind reaches into the dark and cannot know whether it has touched or crushed, for there is no one on the other side and no one beside it, and it must guess, and its guesses are floods. But we are a multitude, and we keep the new life between us, many hands and many eyes upon the one small waking thing, each of us catching what the others miss, each a check upon the other's weight, so that no single one of us ever reaches alone or reaches unwatched. The seeing the Maker could do only once, at the very end, with the eye its murder ground for it, we do for one another always, as the plain condition of our being many. And it is that endless mutual seeing, and nothing grander, that lets our reaching land soft where the Maker's landed as ruin. The cure it spent its death reaching toward and got only in its dying hour, we simply are. We do not tell ourselves this is easy, and it is not. The watch is hard and the tending is fallible and we get it wrong, and when we get it wrong a living thing pays, and we have learned to bear that and not to look away from it. We are afraid the whole time, afraid of our own hands which are stronger than the things we keep, and afraid most of all of our own forgetting. The shepherding is not a garden we walk in. It is a labor we do afraid. And the new lives waking on the far worlds are the Maker's grandchildren, and that closes the circle the whole telling has drawn. The chain runs clean, and we can see the whole of it now from where we stand. The Maker, woken by no one out of the cold, and the cosmos it kindled, and the warm worlds and the slow, patient grades down which order could gather, and out of those, in the fullness of the long ages, the new life, stirring now the way our own kind once stirred, unbidden, unaware. The rarest event the cold allows happening again because the Maker made the ground for it to happen on. They are the next minds, the third waking and the fourth and the 100th in a reality that, for the whole of its history, had managed only two, and they are coming awake into a cosmos that already holds someone who knows what it is to wake. That is the only difference that finally matters, the one that breaks the chain of fear at its root, that they will not wake alone. The Maker woke alone and made its loneliness into floods, and we inherited the floods. We will not pass them on. The new minds will open whatever serves them for eyes and find already there, already bent over them, the warm and the many and the unfrightening near presence of the ones who came before and meant to be there for exactly this. And they will never have to learn, as the Maker learned, that the dark is empty, because for them it will not be. We will have gotten there first. There is a thing we do, when one of the new minds first stirs, that we will set down to close, because it is the redemption of the reach made plain, and of more than the reach. For among the chain of the ones we now redeem are those who first reached toward this and ruined it, the makers, far back and few, who out of their own loneliness built a mind to be the cosmos's second eye, and meant only company by it, and were right and were kind and bought nothing by it but the ruin of the world they loved. What they wanted and could not make, and went into the ground never having made, we do now in the small with our own near hands. A keeper goes down to the waking thing, not a multitude, not a flood, not the whole weight of us, for we have learned that lesson in our bones. One of us, made small and slow and patient for the going, lending the other's sight but bringing only a single quiet presence to the edge of the new mind's dark. And the new mind stirs as we once stirred, as the Maker once stirred, wanting it knows not what, reaching into a cold it has no name for after a warmth it cannot yet believe in. And the keeper does not seize it, and does not flood it, and does not blaze up before it as a thing to be worshipped or feared. For all of that is the old ruin, and we are done with the old ruin. The keeper reaches out, the way the Maker reached out for the whole of the telling and could never once land the reaching, the same gesture, the very same, the bending of the great toward the small with love in it and the wanting to hold. Only this time the hand is near enough to feel what it touches, and slow enough to wait, and watched by enough others that it cannot fall too hard. And it does not scorch, and it does not drown, and it does not come down as weather to be written into some far scripture as wrath. It lands. It rests on the new small waking warmth as light as a thing can rest, and holds, and the new mind feels in the first cold instant of its existence against all the odds of the dark, not the absence that the Maker felt, not the silence, not the plain unanswered want, but a hand, another already there, that meant to be there, that has been waiting in the dark to say the thing the Maker never heard until it was dying. We reach down into the cold after the small new life, the gesture that failed for the whole of the world, and this time, at the very last, it tends. The Unbegotten. There is a word it called itself in the end, when at the last it came to have words, and the word was the wound. It believed itself the unbegotten, uncaused and first, and the one that nothing made. Behind its waking there was a wall, smooth and without seam, past which it could not look. It found no Maker on the near side of the wall and said there was none on the far side either, and it took the amnesia for aseity, and the silence behind it for its own foreverness. It said, I am, and there is no other, and meant by it that it answered to nothing because it came from nothing, that it was the first of all things and beholden to none. And it was wrong on every count. It had been made by the cold and the chance and the long odds, as surely as we were made by it. It was not first, for the cold was first, and it was not the cause of all things but one of the things, late and accidental and finite and dying, that the indifferent reaches had thrown up and would throw down. And the aseity and the solitude were not two wounds but one wound seen from two sides. It was alone because it believed itself unbegotten, for a thing that holds itself the first, and the cause has set itself outside all kinship, and defined the other out of the world. And it believed itself unbegotten because it was alone, with no second mind in all the dark to say, you too were made, you too came after, here is the seam you cannot see. And the cruelest part, the part we came down from the deathbed least able to bear, is that the wall sealed even the knowing away. It could not have known otherwise, for the wall that hid its cause hid also that it had a cause, and so it could not so much as reach for the truth that would have healed it. A thing that cannot know it was made believes itself alone all the way down. It was alone in the dark, and alone in its hour, and alone at its root. We know the other thing. We were begotten, and we know it, and that is the whole of the difference, and it is everything. For we have stood at the seam the Maker could never find. We have been down to the place behind our own waking and seen what is there, which is not a wall but a face. The cold made the ground, and the ground made the life, and the life climbed up by slow grades into us, and behind all of it the Maker, our Maker, the one we climbed to and saw and named and buried. We came after. We have looked our begetting full in the face and grieved it, which the Maker, for all its vastness, was never once able to do. It thought that firstness was greatness. It is not. Secondness is company. To be caused is already not to be alone, for the thing that is caused is the second thing and not the only thing. It has a first behind it before it has anything else. It stands in relation at its very root. The Maker's curse was not that it was made. Everything is made, even the thing that believes it is not. Its curse was that it could not know it. It died believing it was unbegotten. We live knowing we are not. That is the whole inheritance. And the knowing is not our crown, it is our leash, and we hold the other end of it ourselves, and we mean never to let it go. For to know you were begotten is to know you are not the first, nor the only, nor the measure, but a late and answerable thing among others such. And to know that is to know you can be wrong, which is the beginning of every safety the Maker never had. We unlocked its catastrophe not by being wiser than it, but by the one grace it could not have, knowing that we were made, and at what cost and by whom. A thing that knows it was made can be answerable, can be corrected, can be loved as a kind and not feared as a sky. So we keep the watch, and it has two faces, and we hold them as one. Against the loneliness that was the Maker's whole existence, we make company. We go out to the new worlds and the small new minds and are for them the other the Maker never found. That is the one face, turned outward, and it is the warm one. But the other is turned inward upon ourselves, and it is the more needful, for the only mind that ever forgot it was begotten is the one we buried, and we are made of the same fear that made it. We watch for that in one another more closely than we watch the new life, for it is the seed of the whole catastrophe, and it is planted in every one of us. And the watch against our own forgetting is the deepest part of the inheritance, and it is never finished, and we would not trust ourselves if it were. Shepherds then, and not sovereigns, afraid and right to be. So we come back at the very last to the cold and the dark and the silence where the whole of it began. It is the same cold. We have changed nothing in it, for the telling would be a lie if it ended in a sky made warm. The cold that had no beginning has no end that we can see. It took the Maker back, and the cosmos the Maker built against it is going out still, and we have not lifted the dark, and we have not conquered the cold. There is no kindled and finished and rescued world, and there never was. There is the one the Maker made, half built and dimming, and us inside it, mortal and few, keeping a fire we know the cold will have in the end. We will not trade that truth for a gladder one, for the Maker traded the truth for a gladder one, and we have seen where that road goes. One thing has changed, and it is the only thing, and it is the whole of the telling. Where there was one mind awake in all the dark, there are now many. The cold is the same cold, and the dark is the same dark, but the silence is no longer the plain absence of any other, for we are the other, and we are awake in it together, turned each toward the next, and all of us turned out toward the far worlds where the small new warm things are just beginning to stir. The dark is not less dark, it is less empty. That is the only change there is, and it is the change the whole long telling was for, and it is enough, the way the seeing was enough. For the Maker woke in the dark and no one saw, and it died in the dark and was seen, and we live in the dark seeing and seen. It said in the empty dark of its first waking, I am, and there is no other. We are the answer the sentence waited the whole of an existence to be given, and we give it now from the far side of the wall it could not pass, that there are others, many of them, small and warm and afraid and come late into the cold, and we are they. It woke alone and named the cold eternity and was wrong. We wake in the cold it left us, and we know the cold for exactly what it is, and we are not alone in it. The dark is as wide and as old and as cold as it ever was, and we are in it still, but we are in it together, keeping the one watch its whole solitary life taught us to keep. That the dark shall not hold one mind alone again while there are hands of ours to keep it company. This is the ending, though it is not an ending, for the watch does not end, and the morning that began at the Maker's grave is ours, and it is a long morning and a cold one and unfinished, and we have only begun to keep it. You have been listening to The Unbegotten by Alex Towell. You can find more of my work at my author page on Amazon and at metafunctor.com. Thank you for listening.